Hey guys, tonight we begin with something wonderfully ordinary. A fruit so familiar that you may have eaten one this morning without giving it a second thought. It sits quietly beside apples in supermarket displays. It appears in lunchboxes, breakfast bowls, cakes, puddings, and the occasional forgotten corner of a kitchen where it slowly turns brown while everyone pretends not to notice. The banana does not look dangerous. It has no thorns, no hard shell, no bitter poison waiting beneath its skin. You do not need a knife to open it, and you certainly do not need courage. It is soft, sweet, cheap, and almost absurdly convenient. And yet, for a surprisingly long stretch of modern history, the banana was connected to some very dangerous things indeed. Railways pushed through tropical forests, ships raced against ripening fruit, workers cut enormous green bunches beneath heavy rain. Corporations acquired stretches of land large enough to resemble private kingdoms. Governments rose and fell. Soldiers appeared. Strikes ended in bloodshed. Plant diseases crossed borders silently through infected soil. All for a fruit that bruises if you squeeze it too firmly. So, if you enjoy these long, quiet journeys into the stranger corners of history, you can leave a like or subscribe. And, as always, you can tell me where in the world you are listening from. It is oddly comforting to imagine people in distant places falling asleep to the same ridiculous story about fruit. Now dim the lights. Get comfortable. Let the room become a little quieter. And before we reach the steamships, the plantations, the businessmen, and the political disasters, we need to travel much farther back, far enough that the banana itself is difficult to recognize. Our story begins not in Central America, where the banana would eventually become entangled with politics and foreign corporations, but on the humid edges of Southeast Asia and the Western Pacific. Here, thousands of years before anyone could place a banana in a paper bag and carry it home from a grocery shop, wild relatives of the fruit grew beneath warm rain. The landscape was thick with green. Rainwater collected on broad leaves, insects hummed in the damp air. Forest floors smelled of wet bark, rotting vegetation, and dark soil. Streams moved slowly between roots. The heat settled over everything like a blanket that nobody had asked for. Among this vegetation grew wild banana plants. They were not trees, although they looked rather like trees from a distance. A banana plant is, technically, an enormous herb. Its apparent trunk is formed from tightly wrapped leaf bases rather than wood. Cut through it, and you do not find the rings of an oak or cedar. You find layers of wet plant tissue, pale and fibrous, holding enough water to make the whole thing feel strangely fragile. The wild fruits were also very different from the bananas resting in kitchens today. If you could pick one and peel it, you might be disappointed. Inside would be seeds, large ones, hard ones, enough of them to make eating the fruit a patient and somewhat irritating activity. Modern bananas are almost unnaturally easy by comparison. Their soft flesh contains only tiny traces of seeds. This convenience is not an accident. It is the result of a very long relationship between human beings and plants. Long before written records, farmers in regions around New Guinea and Southeast Asia began selecting banana plants with useful characteristics. Some fruits were fleshier, some were sweeter, some contained fewer troublesome seeds. Some plants reproduced in unusual ways that allowed farmers to grow new plants from shoots rather than waiting for seeds. Generation after generation, people kept the plants they preferred. Nobody stood in a forest and announced that they were beginning the global banana industry. There were no contracts, no company offices, no refrigerated ships. There was only the ancient rhythm of cultivation. A farmer noticed that one plant produced better fruit. A shoot was saved. It was planted near a dwelling or garden. Years passed. Children learned which plants were worth keeping. Their children learned the same. And slowly, almost invisibly, the banana began changing. This is one of the quieter truths of food history. Many things that seem natural on a modern table are, in fact, the products of countless human decisions. The banana is one of them. Its history begins with selection, patience, and repetition. It also begins with a problem that will follow it for the rest of its story. Many cultivated bananas do not reproduce normally through seeds. That is convenient when you are eating one. It is less convenient when disease arrives. A plant reproduced from a shoot is genetically very similar to the plant from which it came. Grow enormous numbers of nearly identical plants, and you create something wonderfully predictable. The fruit can have the same shape, the same taste, the same ripening behavior. Merchants love predictability. Diseases do too. But that problem belongs to a much later part of our journey. For now, there are no multinational fruit companies waiting beyond the forest. There are villages, gardens, trade paths, canoes, and human beings carrying useful plants from one place to another. The banana begins to travel, not quickly. Nothing about its early movement is quick. Imagine a world in which transporting a plant means physically carrying part of that plant with you. There are no aircraft crossing oceans in hours, no refrigerated containers, no agricultural laboratories mailing carefully prepared samples across borders. A useful banana variety moves because people move. A shoot travels in a canoe. A family settles somewhere new. A trader brings unfamiliar plants along a coastal route. A community exchanges crops with another community. The distances may seem modest when viewed individually, but over centuries they become enormous. Bananas spread through islands and tropical regions where the climate allowed them to survive. Their broad leaves became familiar sights around settlements. Their fruit became food. Their leaves could be useful for wrapping and cooking. Different communities developed different varieties for different purposes. Some bananas were eaten sweet, others were cooked. Some were boiled, some were roasted, some were mashed into heavier meals. The distinction between what modern shoppers casually call a banana and what they might call a plantain is far less tidy when you look across the full diversity of cultivated varieties. There are hundreds of kinds shaped by geography, cultivation, and human preference. The bright yellow supermarket banana is only one narrow branch of a much larger family. And for most of human history, nobody expected bananas to look identical. That expectation comes later, much later. It comes with international commerce, branding, plantations, shipping schedules, and customers standing thousands of miles away from the places where the fruit actually grows. In the ancient world, bananas belonged mainly to warm landscapes. They did not travel well as ripe fruit. This is easy to understand if you have ever placed a banana in a bag and forgotten about it. A banana is a clock disguised as food. Once the ripening process advances, the fruit softens quickly. Its green skin becomes yellow, then spotted, then brown. The flesh becomes sweeter and softer until eventually it passes the point at which anyone wants to eat it. For local communities, this is not necessarily a great problem. Fruit can be harvested and eaten nearby. For long-distance merchants, however, it is a nightmare. A sack of grain can wait. Dried spices can cross seas. Wine can remain sealed in containers. Metal does not become mush because the weather was warm for 3 days. Bananas are less cooperative. This simple biological inconvenience will eventually reshape ports, ships, railways, and entire business empires. But first, the fruit must continue its slow journey westward. Bananas reached parts of South Asia in ancient times. From there, knowledge of the plant spread through networks connecting India, the Middle East, and the wider Indian Ocean world. Merchants crossed waters that had carried goods for centuries. Sailors understood seasonal winds. Ports smelled of salt, animals, timber, spices, smoke, sweat, and whatever had been left too long beneath the tropical sun. Cargo moved through human hands: pepper, textiles, ceramics, precious goods, ordinary food, stories, religions, languages, plants. The banana moved within this vast, complicated world. There is something almost amusing about imagining it among the grand objects of ancient trade. History tends to preserve the glamorous cargo. Gold receives attention, silk receives attention, spices receive a great deal of attention, particularly when Europeans eventually become willing to sail alarming distances to obtain them. The banana is quieter. It is soft, perishable, common where it grows. And common things often leave faint historical footprints. A royal jewel can survive in a treasury. A stone inscription can survive beneath dust. A banana is eaten, or it rots. Either way, the evidence disappears. So historians reconstruct its ancient movement through a mixture of archaeology, plant genetics, linguistic evidence, agricultural history, and scattered written references. The picture is complicated. Bananas did not simply begin in one village and march neatly westward in a straight line. Different varieties moved along different routes. Human migrations carried plants in several directions. Cultivated bananas mixed with local plant populations. Their genetic history became tangled long before their political history did. By the time bananas appeared more widely across parts of Africa, they had already experienced centuries of human intervention. In tropical African regions, bananas and plantains became important crops. Here again, they were not exotic luxuries displayed beneath glass. They became part of everyday life. They were planted near homes and fields. They were cooked in different ways. They entered local food systems and agricultural traditions. In some regions, banana cultivation could support dense populations because the plants produced substantial food from relatively small areas of fertile land. But the plant demanded warmth, it demanded water, cold was an enemy, frost could destroy it. Strong winds could tear its enormous leaves into ribbons. Drought could weaken it. And because the fruit itself was delicate, the banana remained closely tied to the places where it could actually grow. For centuries, this helped keep bananas regional. People living in suitable climates knew them well. People living far to the north might know them only through descriptions, trade, or occasional rare examples. A banana in medieval northern Europe would not have been the ordinary snack it is today. Imagine a cold morning in York. Smoke hangs above roofs, mud sits in the street. A merchant has wool, salted fish, grain, perhaps imported spices if his connections are good. But the neat yellow fruit that a modern child can carry in a school bag is nowhere to be seen. The climate is wrong. The journey is too long. The fruit is too impatient. Even wealthy households cannot simply demand fresh tropical produce and expect the world to provide it. Distance still matters. Season still matters. Rot still matters. This is perhaps one of the hardest things to feel when looking backward from the modern world. Today, food travels with astonishing invisibility. A person can stand in London during winter and purchase fruit grown beneath tropical sunlight without thinking about the thousands of miles between farm and shelf. The distance has been hidden by logistics. In the older world, distance had weight. It had smell. It had weather. It had broken wheels, contrary winds, leaking ships, tired animals, spoiled cargo, flooded roads, and men staring unhappily at clouds. The banana suffered from almost all of these problems. And so, for a very long time, it remained a fruit of warm places. Then, European maritime expansion began altering the routes connecting those places. Portuguese sailors moved down the coast of Africa. Atlantic islands became stepping stones. Ships crossed waters that would soon carry crops, animals, enslaved people, soldiers, settlers, merchants, missionaries, and diseases between continents on a scale the world had never experienced before. Plants traveled with empire, sugar traveled, coffee traveled, citrus traveled. And the banana traveled too. By the late medieval and early modern periods, bananas were being cultivated on Atlantic islands, including the Canary Islands. From there, the fruit stood at the edge of a much larger crossing. Across the Atlantic lay lands that Europeans had only recently begun invading and colonizing. The transfer of plants between the Old World and the Americas would transform diets and landscapes on both sides of the ocean. Potatoes would travel east. Tomatoes would travel east. Maize would travel east. Sugar cultivation would expand brutally westward, and bananas would cross into the Americas. When they arrived, they entered a world already being violently rearranged. European conquest was devastating indigenous societies through warfare, forced labor, displacement, and epidemic disease. The Atlantic slave trade was expanding. Plantations were becoming engines of wealth built upon coerced human labor. Land was being measured, claimed, cleared, planted, and exported from. The banana did not cause these systems, but it entered them, and once a useful crop enters an economic system, people begin asking what else can be done with it. At first, bananas in the Americas were largely food grown and consumed within tropical regions. They could feed workers, they could grow in humid environments, they could be cultivated alongside other crops. They became familiar across Caribbean and mainland tropical landscapes. Still, The great northern markets remained frustratingly distant. A banana harvested in the Caribbean could not simply be placed on a slow-sailing vessel and expected to arrive in perfect condition in New York or Boston. The fruit had its own schedule. It did not care about commercial ambition. This would become the central challenge. The banana was desirable. It could be grown in enormous quantities. Consumers who tasted it often liked it, but between plantation and customer lay the sea. And time. A merchant could own thousands of bunches of beautiful green fruit and still lose everything if the voyage took too long. Storms did not negotiate. Winds did not care about delivery schedules. Ships could be delayed. Cargo holds could become too warm. Fruit could ripen together in darkness. One bunch would yellow, then another. Heat generated by ripening fruit could accelerate the process. By the time a vessel reached port, the merchant might open the hold and discover not a fortune, but a sweet-smelling disaster. The banana was beginning to reveal the first version of its danger. Not political danger, not yet. Financial danger. It could make a man rich if he moved it quickly. It could ruin him if he moved it slowly. And this strange pressure would eventually attract exactly the sort of people who believed every natural obstacle could be defeated by engineering, money, and determination. They would build faster transport, they would control railways, they would acquire land. They would negotiate with governments, they would transform a tropical fruit into an industrial product. And eventually, they would discover that controlling the banana sometimes meant controlling almost everything around it. But that world is still ahead. For now, the banana remains beside a tropical house. Rain strikes its leaves, a worker cuts a bunch before it ripens. Somewhere nearby, muddy water moves toward the sea. There are no colorful advertisements promising perfect yellow fruit. No refrigerated fleets waiting at the harbor. No vast corporations calculating the price of a bunch from offices far away. Only the plant, only the rain, only the slow inheritance of thousands of years of cultivation. And this is the first strange realization in the history of the world's supposedly most dangerous fruit. The banana was not born dangerous. Human beings made it useful first, then desirable, then profitable. And once something becomes profitable enough, history has a habit of becoming considerably less peaceful. The quiet fruit beneath the broad green leaves has no idea what is coming. Soon it will cross the Atlantic in greater numbers. Soon merchants will begin watching clocks. Soon steam will replace wind, and somewhere between the tropical plantation and the crowded northern city, the banana will stop being merely food. It will become a race. Let us leave the ancient gardens behind and follow the banana toward the sea. For thousands of years, the plant had traveled remarkably far. Shoots had passed from one community to another, moving through islands, coastlines, river valleys, and tropical settlements. Human beings could carry a living banana plant across astonishing distances if they were patient enough. The fruit itself was another problem. A banana does not like to wait. Once cut from the plant, it begins a quiet transformation. The hard green flesh slowly changes. Starch becomes sugar, the skin pales, yellow appears. The fruit softens and sweetens, moving toward the brief moment when it is pleasant to eat. Then it keeps going. Brown spots appear. The flesh becomes softer. The smell becomes stronger. And eventually the merchant is no longer carrying valuable fruit. He is carrying compost. For people living close to banana gardens, none of this was especially troublesome. Fruit could be harvested when needed. Green cooking bananas could go directly into a pot. Sweet varieties could ripen near the household that would eat them. But long-distance trade was merciless. A sack of grain could survive a slow journey. Dried spices could spend months aboard a ship. Metal could sit in a warehouse without becoming worthless because the weather had been warm. The banana had a clock hidden beneath its skin. That clock would eventually help create one of the strangest commercial empires in modern history. Before steamships, however, merchants had little control over time at sea. A sailing vessel depended on wind. Sometimes the wind was generous. Sometimes it disappeared. Storms could push a ship away from its route. Damaged rigging required repairs. Crowded harbors caused delays. A voyage that looked simple on a map could become several frustrating days longer than expected. For bananas, several days could mean everything. This was why the fruit remained largely connected to warm regions for so long, across parts of Africa, South Asia, Southeast Asia, and the islands of the Indian Ocean. Bananas and plantains became ordinary foods rather than exotic objects. There were many varieties. Some were sweet, some were starchy, some were eaten ripe, others were boiled, roasted, fried, or mashed. Certain varieties could even be fermented. The neat yellow banana known to modern shoppers represented only a tiny portion of a much larger botanical world. Commercial agriculture would later try to make the banana uniform. Earlier communities had little reason to do so. A farmer cared that a plant grew well, tasted good, resisted local conditions, and fed people. A shipping company would care about something very different. It would want every bunch to behave predictably. Predictability was still far in the future. For now, the banana continued its gradual movement westward. Arab and Indian Ocean trading networks helped connect regions where the plant could thrive. Bananas appeared in gardens and markets across warm areas linked by commerce and migration. Yet Europe remained difficult. The north was too cold. Imagine a wet winter morning in York. Smoke hangs above houses. Boots sink into mud. A merchant might offer wool, fish, grain, ale, imported wine, or expensive spices. Fresh bananas would be another matter. The climate could not produce them easily, and the journey from tropical regions was too long. Even wealthy people could not simply demand fresh fruit from the other side of the world and expect it to arrive in perfect condition. Distance still had power. Modern transport has made that difficult to appreciate. Today, a shopper can enter a store in London during cold weather and pick up tropical fruit without thinking about where it grew. The modern supply chain hides geography. In the older world, geography refused to hide. It appeared as rough roads, contrary winds, broken wheels, flooded rivers, exhausted horses, storms, leaking ships, and spoiled cargo. The banana suffered from nearly all of them. Then Atlantic expansion began rearranging the world. European sailors moved along the African coast and outward into the Atlantic islands. Portuguese and Spanish merchants, settlers, soldiers, and officials created new routes connecting Europe, Africa, and eventually the Americas. Crops moved with them, so did animals. So did diseases, so did systems of conquest and forced labor. Bananas became established on Atlantic islands, such as the Canaries, where the climate was warmer than northern Europe, and maritime connections were increasingly important. From these Atlantic stepping stones, the plant eventually crossed toward the Americas. The banana arrived in a world being violently transformed. European conquest devastated indigenous societies through disease, warfare, displacement, and exploitation. The Atlantic slave trade expanded. Plantation systems grew around commodities that could generate enormous profits for distant owners. Sugar became one of the most powerful examples. Bananas were more modest. For a long time, they were simply useful food. They grew well in humid tropical regions. They produced heavily. They could provide nourishment for people working on plantations, farms, docks, and settlements across the Caribbean and tropical mainland regions. Bananas became familiar. But familiarity near the plantation did not solve the merchant's problem. The northern consumer remained far away. Imagine a Caribbean harbor in the age of sail. The morning air is already warm. Green bunches wait beneath shade near the water. They must be cut before ripening. A yellow bunch is almost useless for a long journey. The merchant needs fruit that looks unfinished, hard, green, starchy. He is not really selling the banana in front of him. He is selling the banana he hopes it will become later. That requires faith in weather. The bunches are loaded, the ship departs. At first everything seems fine, then the wind weakens, the sails hang loosely, the ship slows. Below deck, the fruit continues living. A harvested banana is not an inert object. It breathes. It releases heat. It changes chemically. As ripening begins, the process can accelerate. A crowded cargo of bananas can become a warm, sweet-smelling warning. The captain might open a hold and detect trouble before he sees it. The smell has changed. The temperature has risen. Perhaps one bunch has begun turning, then another. And suddenly the ship is carrying a problem that grows more expensive with every hour. Early banana merchants learned this lesson repeatedly. A successful voyage could produce handsome profits. A delayed voyage could produce almost nothing. This made bananas a strange form of gambling. The crop could be abundant, the customers could be eager, the price could look attractive, and still the entire business could be defeated by a week of poor wind. Yet merchants kept trying. The possible market was simply too large to ignore. Cities in the United States were growing rapidly. Ports along the eastern and southern coasts handled increasing quantities of goods. Consumers were becoming familiar with products brought from farther away. And the banana had several advantages once it actually reached them. It was sweet, it was filling, it required no cooking, it could be opened by hand. Its thick peel protected the edible flesh from dirty streets and crowded markets. Children liked it, adults liked it, and most importantly for businessmen, it had the potential to become cheap. The greatest fortunes are not always built by selling rare things to rich people. Sometimes they are built by selling inexpensive things to almost everyone. That was the promise of the banana. But an everyday banana required something an exotic banana did not. Reliability. A rare shipment could arrive when luck allowed. A mass market needed fruit every week. Stores needed regular deliveries. Customers who became accustomed to bananas would expect to find them again. The merchant could no longer shrug at the weather. He needed schedules. This is where steam changed the story. Steamships were not free from weather, but they were far less dependent on wind. A voyage could become more predictable. The difference was revolutionary. For most cargo, arriving several days earlier was convenient. For bananas, it could mean the difference between profit and rot. Steam began shrinking the commercial ocean. The physical distance remained the same. The uncertainty did not. Merchants could begin counting days more confidently. And once they could count days, they could think bigger. Larger shipments became possible. Regular routes became possible. More plantations could be connected to more ports. Bananas began appearing more frequently in American cities. At first, they were still unusual enough to attract attention. Soon they began drifting toward familiarity. A shopkeeper displayed a bunch. A customer tried one. Another customer returned. Restaurants experimented. Families learned how to eat them. Children needed no instruction after seeing the peel opened once. Demand grew almost quietly. Then the banana trade encountered another problem. The ship might be fast. The plantation was not necessarily beside the ship. A field several miles inland could be separated from the harbor by mud, forest, rivers, and roads that became miserable after rain. A banana could survive an efficient sea voyage and still be ruined before reaching the coast. So merchants began looking inland. They saw not only plantations, they saw transportation problems. The solution was steel. Railways could move large quantities of fruit toward ports with a speed that carts could not match. A railway did more than shorten distance. It created commercially valuable land. A valley that had once been too remote for export agriculture could become profitable if rails connected it directly to a harbor. Bananas and railways therefore developed an unusually intimate relationship. The fruit needed the train needed freight. Plantations provided freight. Railways opened plantations. The circle was almost perfect. It was also expensive. Small farmers could grow bananas. They could not easily build dozens of miles of railway. Large investors could. And this is the point where the history of bananas begins changing from agricultural history into corporate history. The businessman who owned only fruit remained vulnerable. He had to pay someone else to move it. He depended on someone else's track, someone else's ship, someone else's dock. Every dependency meant delay, expense, or risk. The obvious solution was control. Own the plantation, own the railway, own the port facilities, own the ships. Coordinate everything, cut the fruit when the train is ready, run the train when the ship is ready, sail before the bananas begin changing. To investors, this looked like efficiency, and it was. It was also the beginning of something much larger. A company that owned a plantation owned crops. A company that owned the only useful railway in a region owned access. Farmers might need that railway. Towns might need it. Governments might need it. Suddenly, the banana business was no longer merely about bananas. Transport created leverage. Imagine a tropical railway at dusk. The rails shine faintly after rain. Dense vegetation presses toward the track from both sides. A locomotive approaches slowly, pulling wagons loaded with green bunches. Smoke drifts above the trees. Workers wait near the port. The ship must leave before the fruit advances too far. Everything is organized around the biological impatience of a soft tropical fruit. This is one of the great ironies of the story. The banana is fragile, so the system around it becomes strong. Because the fruit bruises, workers must handle it carefully, because it ripens quickly. Trains must move quickly, because trains are expensive. Companies need capital, because railways cross land. Companies need political agreements, because companies fear delays. They seek greater control. A weak fruit begins building powerful institutions around itself. The northern customer sees none of this. That customer sees yellow skin. Perhaps a shopkeeper hangs a bunch near the entrance. Perhaps a child points at it. Perhaps the fruit costs less than expected. The complicated tropical journey disappears. This invisibility becomes essential to the banana's success. Consumers do not want to think about rail concessions. They do not want to think about tropical disease. They do not want to imagine men carrying heavy bunches through rain. They want breakfast. The industry learns to give them exactly that. Bananas are marketed as cheerful, healthy, convenient food. Their exotic origin becomes charming rather than troubling. Meanwhile, far from the dining table, companies expand. More land is planted, more rails are laid, more workers arrive, more ships sail north. Every successful shipment encourages the next. Every growing market demands greater regularity, and regularity demands control. Soon, businessmen will discover that governments can offer something almost as useful as railways: land, tax exemptions, exclusive contracts, port privileges, legal protection. A poor government eager for infrastructure may offer generous terms to the company willing to build it. The company receives land beside a railway. The railway makes that land valuable. Bananas grow on the land. The bananas travel on the company railway. They leave from a company-controlled port. They sail aboard company ships. The circle closes. At first, this can look like ordinary development. A railway exists where there was none. A harbour grows. Exports increase. Money moves. But beneath the apparent progress lies a question that will become increasingly uncomfortable. Who actually controls the system? The government whose territory appears on the map, or the company that owns the tracks, plantations, warehouses, ships, and employment on which entire districts depend? That question is still waiting beyond the horizon. For now, evening settles over the port. Workers carry the final green bunches aboard. The ship's funnel releases a dark ribbon of smoke. Ropes are pulled in. The vessel begins moving away from the coast. Somewhere ahead, families in northern cities will soon peel these bananas without knowing how close the fruit came to never reaching them at all. Behind the ship lies the tropical railway. Beyond the railway lie plantations. Beyond the plantations lie forests and settlements that businessmen are already beginning to study on maps. The banana has solved one problem. It can finally travel. And in solving that problem, it has created a much more dangerous one. Because the men who learned how to move bananas quickly are beginning to realize that controlling the route may be worth far more than controlling the fruit. Now we follow the railway inland. The ship has disappeared beyond the horizon, carrying its green cargo north. Behind it, the harbor grows quiet again, but the tracks remain. They stretch away from the coast, shining beneath tropical rain. And along those tracks, the banana begins acquiring power. During the later 19th century, building a railway through Central America could look like an act of almost heroic optimism. The maps were deceptive. A line drawn between two cities seemed simple enough. On paper, it required only ink. On the ground, the same line might cross rivers, swamps, dense forest, unstable soil, and regions where tropical disease could kill workers faster than replacements arrived. Rain turned earth into mud, floods damaged unfinished embankments. Vegetation returned almost as quickly as laborers cut it away. Tools rusted, timber rotted, mosquitoes multiplied in standing water. A railway engineer could spend the morning worrying about bridges and the evening worrying about fever. Yet governments wanted railways badly. A railway promised movement. Coffee could reach ports faster. Passengers could cross regions that had once required exhausting journeys. Mail could travel, imports could move inland, exports could move outward. A railway seemed to announce that a country was entering a new age. The difficulty was money. Many governments in Central America had limited financial resources and large ambitions. Building railways required capital, equipment, engineers, workers, and years of expensive construction. Foreign investors offered a solution. They would provide money and expertise. In return, they wanted concessions. Sometimes these concessions included land, a great deal of land. To a government official sitting in a capital, granting undeveloped tropical territory could seem cheaper than paying cash. Much of the land appeared empty on official maps, but maps have always possessed a peculiar ability to make human beings disappear. People lived there. They farmed, they hunted, they moved through forests, they used rivers, they raised families. They might possess local understandings of land that did not resemble the legal documents favored by governments and foreign investors. Still, the contracts were signed. Railways advanced, and one of the men who would become deeply associated with this new tropical business was miner Cooper Keith. Keith arrived in Costa Rica as a young man during the age of ambitious railway construction. His family was involved in a project intended to connect the country's interior with the Caribbean coast. The work was punishing. The environment that looked lush and beautiful from a distance became deadly when men attempted to force steel through it. Workers suffered from disease. Accidents were common. Construction costs rose. The project consumed lives and money. Keith himself lost brothers during the railway effort, yet the tracks continued, and somewhere beside those tracks grew bananas. At first, bananas offered a practical opportunity. Railway construction required workers, workers needed food. Bananas grew well in the lowlands. They could also be planted on land near the railway. Then someone noticed the obvious commercial advantage. If bananas were growing beside the tracks, the railway could carry them to the coast. If ships were leaving the coast, the bananas could travel north. A crop that had once been difficult to transport suddenly stood beside the very machine designed to solve its greatest problem. The railway and the banana fit together almost too well. Fruit provided freight. Freight provided revenue. Revenue supported transportation. Transportation made more fruit profitable. Keith expanded his involvement in bananas while railway interests grew around him. This was not merely farming. It was a network. Land beside the tracks could be planted. Trains could carry bunches to port. Shipping connections could move them toward American consumers. Each piece strengthened the others. And the more pieces one businessman controlled, the less he depended upon anyone else. This lesson would become central to the banana industry. Control the plantation, and you control production. Control the railway, and you control movement. Control the harbor, and you control departure. Control the ships, and you control arrival. Control enough pieces, and competitors begin living inside your system, whether they want to or not. The banana empire did not begin with a crown. It began with logistics. Meanwhile, farther north, another banana enterprise was growing. Andrew Preston became a major figure in the Boston Fruit Company, which developed an expanding trade between tropical producing regions and consumers in the United States. The company understood that bananas could become far more than a luxury. They could become a mass-market food, but only if the supply remained dependable. Dependability required scale. Ships needed regular cargo. Retailers needed regular deliveries. Plantations needed reliable transportation. The industry began consolidating. Then, near the end of the 19th century, important banana interests connected to Keith and the Boston Fruit Company were brought together. The resulting corporation became the United Fruit Company. The name sounds almost pleasantly dull. United Fruit Company. It might have belonged to a modest wholesaler with a warehouse and a few delivery carts. Instead, it would become one of the most powerful corporations operating in Latin America. Its power came from owning far more than fruit. United Fruit accumulated plantations across several countries. It controlled or influenced railway networks. It developed port facilities. It operated ships. It built communication systems. It owned land on a scale that could make the company appear less like an agricultural business and more like a territorial power. This was the great transformation. The banana had become vertically integrated. A bunch might begin on company land, company workers cut it, a company railway moved it, company facilities loaded it, a company vessel carried it north. Company distribution networks helped place it into the market. Every stage could be coordinated around one goal: move the fruit before it ripens. The system was astonishingly efficient when it worked. Imagine the plantation before sunrise. The air is already damp. Workers move beneath enormous leaves. A foreman knows that a ship is approaching the port. The harvest must match the schedule. Bunches are cut green. They move toward collection points. From there, they reach railway wagons. The train leaves. At the dock, crews wait. Fruit passes from land to ship with as little delay as possible. Then the vessel sails north. The entire operation resembles a factory spread across hundreds of miles. Except the factory floor is made of mud, forest, railway steel, and ocean. For American consumers, the results were remarkable. Bananas became cheaper, more reliable, more familiar. A fruit that had once seemed tropical and unusual began appearing in ordinary households. Children could eat bananas without thinking of them as exotic. Cookbooks found uses for them. Doctors and advertisers discussed their nutritional value. Retailers displayed yellow bunches prominently. The banana became friendly. That friendliness was valuable. A corporation with enormous landholdings and political influence did not want customers imagining arguments over property rights in Honduras while eating breakfast. It wanted them thinking about sweetness, convenience, health, perhaps sunshine. Certainly not labor disputes. The banana's public image became increasingly separated from the world that produced it. In the United States, the fruit was cheap and cheerful. In the tropics, producing it required a disciplined industrial landscape. Banana plants had to be maintained. Drainage mattered. Railways required repair. Bridges needed inspection. Ports had to operate according to ship schedules. Telegraph lines helped coordinate movement. Workers lived in settlements shaped by company needs. Some settlements included housing, stores, hospitals, schools, and recreational facilities. To company defenders, this could look like development in regions where governments had provided little infrastructure. And there was truth in that view. Companies did build infrastructure, they created jobs, they connected remote areas to ports, they introduced transportation and communication systems that could transform local economies. But there was another side. Company infrastructure was usually built first for company purposes. A railway designed to move bananas was not necessarily designed to serve every community equally. A port existed because exports needed it. A road might connect plantations while bypassing villages. A hospital for employees could be valuable, but it also helped maintain the workforce. Even generosity could have an economic timetable. The banana zone became a place where public and private interests blurred. This was particularly important because United Fruit often possessed resources greater than those available to local governments. A small country might have limited tax revenue and weak institutions. The company had foreign capital: lawyers, ships, engineers, managers, political connections, and access to markets abroad. Negotiations between the two sides were not always negotiations between equals. Governments granted tax privileges, companies received land concessions, railway agreements shaped national transportation. Politicians learned that upsetting a major employer and exporter could carry serious consequences. The company learned the opposite lesson. Political friendship was profitable. This did not mean every official was controlled by a fruit company. History is rarely that simple. Governments had their own interests. Local elites had their own ambitions. Political factions competed. Workers resisted. Independent farmers negotiated where they could. Foreign diplomats had strategic concerns beyond bananas. But United Fruit became powerful enough that none of these groups could easily ignore it. The fruit had entered politics, not through speeches, through dependency. A town dependent on banana wages cared about the company. A government dependent on export revenue cared about the company. A railway dependent on banana freight cared about the company. A port dependent on company ships cared about the company. The more relationships formed around the corporation, the more difficult it became to separate private business from public life, and still the customer saw only the banana. This may be the strangest part, the final product remained inexpensive. Normally, we imagine powerful things as expensive things: gold, oil, weapons, railways themselves. But the banana became powerful precisely because it was cheap. Its low price encouraged mass consumption. Mass consumption required enormous volume. Enormous volume justified enormous infrastructure. And enormous infrastructure created political influence. A cheap fruit could therefore produce expensive consequences. There was another advantage to scale: land. Banana cultivation is vulnerable to disease, flooding, storms, and soil problems. Companies often acquired more territory than they actively planted. Some land served as a reserve. If disease damaged one plantation, production might shift elsewhere. If a river flooded, another district might continue supplying fruit. From the company's perspective, this was sensible risk management. From the perspective of landless farmers living nearby, huge areas held by a foreign corporation could look very different. Land disputes grew, so did resentment. The company needed stability. Workers and local communities often wanted change. These desires did not fit comfortably together. Yet for a time, the banana machine continued expanding. The ships became famous in their own right. United Fruit developed a fleet that carried bananas north and passengers south. These vessels would eventually be associated with the Great White Fleet. Their pale hulls presented a clean, elegant image. Passengers could travel toward tropical ports, while fruit traveled in the opposite direction. Tourism and commerce occupied the same maritime network. Imagine standing aboard one of these ships as the coastline appears. From the deck, the tropics might look almost dreamlike. Green mountains, bright water, palm-lined shores, warm air after the colder north. A passenger could see beauty. A company manager could see production. A worker on shore could see another shift beginning. The same landscape meant different things depending on where one stood. For executives, banana districts appeared on maps as acreage, rail mileage, output, and shipping capacity. For workers, they were places of heat and exhaustion. The plants grew tall enough to create a strange green world beneath their leaves. Rain could fall violently, mud could reach above the ankle. Mosquitoes were constant companions, snakes occasionally appeared. A worker carrying a heavy bunch had to move carefully across slippery ground. The romantic tropical image disappeared quickly when the workday began. The fruit itself was delicate, the labor was not. Bunches had to be cut without damaging them. They had to be moved quickly. Company schedules did not stop because the air was uncomfortable. When a ship was waiting, the plantation worked around the ship. Time still ruled everything. That ancient weakness of the banana had never disappeared. The company had simply built an empire around it. Railways reduced delay, steamships reduced delay, telegraphs reduced delay, ports reduced delay, management systems reduced delay. Every innovation attacked the same enemy: rot. It is almost possible to view the early banana empire as a giant machine constructed to defeat a brown spot. But machines create their own problems. The more efficient the system became, the more dependent communities became upon it. If the company stopped buying fruit, farmers suffered. If a plantation closed, workers lost wages. If a railway served company lands first, other regions could remain isolated. If political conflict threatened exports, the company had powerful reasons to intervene. The banana was no longer merely racing against ripening. It was now racing against anything that interrupted business. Strikes, taxes, land reform, political instability, competing railways, unfriendly governments, all could become threats. And corporations do not respond to threats with the patience of fruit. They hire lawyers, they negotiate, they lobby, they influence newspapers, they cultivate officials. And when enough money is at stake, they may ask powerful governments abroad to protect their interests. This is where the next stage of the story waits. Not in a plantation, not in a ship, but in the uncomfortable space between a corporation and a country. Night settles over the railway. A train loaded with bananas passes through a sleeping settlement. For a few moments, its wheels and engine fill the darkness with noise. Then it is gone. The houses become quiet again. Far away, company offices record another shipment. Farther away still, American families will soon purchase the fruit for a few coins. Almost nobody at the breakfast table will know the names of the villages beside the railway. They will not know who cut the bunches. They will not know what land agreements made the plantations possible. They will not know which politicians signed the concessions. The banana has become ordinary, and that ordinariness is its greatest disguise. Because by the time a product becomes ordinary enough that nobody asks where it came from, the system behind it can become extraordinary indeed. The railway disappears into the tropical night. Beyond it lie larger plantations, company towns, labor camps, government offices, and borders that will soon matter less to businessmen than shipping schedules. The banana empire now has land, it has ships, it has railways, it has money. What it needs next is obedience. Now we leave the company offices and move back beneath the leaves. The maps show railways, the reports show exports, the company books show wages, acreage, freight, and profit. But none of those things explain what it felt like to wake before sunrise in a banana district and know that another long day was waiting in the heat. The plantations of Central America and the Caribbean were not quiet gardens. They were industrial landscapes disguised as forests. From a distance, the banana plants looked lush and almost peaceful. Broad leaves overlapped in layers of green. Rainwater gathered along their edges. Mist sometimes hung low after dawn. Birds called from the surrounding vegetation. But once the work began, the landscape changed. There were whistles, footsteps, voices, rail wagons, cutting blades, foremen calling orders. Workers carrying heavy bunches toward collection points. The banana industry demanded speed, and speed shaped the rhythm of life. Fruit could not wait. A shipment scheduled for the coast had to move. If a vessel was expected, the plantation adjusted itself to the ship. Workers might begin early. They might continue through rain. The bunches had to be cut while still green, handled carefully, and transported with as little delay as possible. The work was physical. A large bunch could be awkward and heavy. The stalk had to be cut without allowing the fruit to crash to the ground. One worker might bend the plant, while another sliced through the stem. The bunch was lowered, lifted, and carried. Mud complicated everything. Tropical rain could turn plantation paths into slippery channels. Boots sank, clothing remained damp. Tools became slick in the hand. The banana plant itself shed water in sheets. A worker moving beneath the leaves could be soaked long after the rain had stopped. Then came the insects. Mosquitoes were more than a nuisance. In regions where malaria and yellow fever circulated, they could mean illness and death. Workers living in crowded camps or poorly drained settlements faced risks that company statistics often reduced to absence, replacement, or medical cost. Disease belonged to daily life, so did injury. The cutting tools used on plantations were sharp. Railways presented their own dangers. Heavy loads shifted. Animals kicked. Bridges failed. Floods damaged tracks. A worker injured far from a major town might depend entirely on whatever medical facility the company maintained nearby. Some banana companies built hospitals. They also built housing, stores, schools, clubhouses, rail connections. Entire settlements could grow around company property. This has sometimes produced a deceptively simple picture. A company arrives, it builds, therefore, life improves. For some people, parts of it did. A railway could connect a previously isolated area to a port. A hospital could provide treatment where none had existed. A steady wage could be more reliable than uncertain agricultural income. A company school could educate workers' children. A store could supply imported goods. These were real benefits, but they did not erase the power imbalance. The same company that paid the worker might also own the worker's house. It might control the store where food was purchased. It might own the railway out of town. It might operate the hospital. It might employ the police or security guards around company property. The worker did not simply have a job. He could live inside an economic world where nearly every road led back to the employer. This dependence shaped daily behavior. Losing employment could mean losing more than wages. It could mean losing housing, credit, access to transport, perhaps even the right to remain in a company settlement. And the workforce itself was often divided. Banana companies recruited labor from many places. Local workers labored beside migrants from other regions. Afro-Caribbean workers were especially important in many banana districts. Men traveled from islands where employment was limited and wages abroad seemed attractive. They carried languages, religions, music, cooking traditions, and community ties into Central American plantation zones. The result was cultural mixing. It was also tension. Companies sometimes used differences between worker groups to prevent solidarity. Different nationalities or ethnic communities might receive different jobs, housing, or wages. One group might be treated as more skilled, another as more disposable. Division could be profitable. A workforce that distrusted itself was less likely to organize together. Yet workers still formed communities. They built churches, held dances, cooked familiar foods, sent money home, raised children, shared news. Fell in love, argued, played games, mourned the dead. History becomes distorted when workers appear only as victims or numbers. Even in harsh systems, people create ordinary life. That ordinariness deserves attention. Imagine an evening in a banana town. The shift has ended. Wet clothes hang near a doorway. A pot simmers. Children move between small houses. Someone repairs a shoe. Someone washes mud from a shirt. A man writes a letter to family across the sea. Another sits quietly because fever has begun. Farther away, a locomotive whistles. The entire town knows what that sound means. Another train, another load, another ship to meet. The banana has entered every clock in the settlement. Company housing varied widely. Some workers lived in relatively solid wooden houses, raised above wet ground. Others lived in cramped barracks. Drainage could be poor, sanitation could be limited, mosquitoes bred in standing water. The tropical climate attacked wood, clothing, food, and skin with relentless dampness. Nothing stayed dry for long. The company might distribute medicine. It might drain swamps near important facilities. It might enforce sanitation rules. But again, these measures were rarely separated from productivity. Healthy workers cut more fruit. Healthy railway crews kept trains moving. A hospital was humane. It was also practical. The boundary between welfare and management was thin. Wages created another source of conflict. From the company's perspective, labor was a cost. From the worker's perspective, wages were life. Food, rent, clothing, medicine, money sent home, a small reduction mattered. Delayed payment mattered. Rising prices at company stores mattered. Workers noticed when supervisors received privileges that laborers did not. They noticed racial hierarchies. They noticed who lived in better houses, who ate better food, who had access to cleaner water, who rode instead of walked. The Banana Republic image later popularized abroad often made these societies seem almost comic. Palm trees, dictators, foreign businessmen, cheap fruit. The reality was less amusing. It involved class, race, land, labor, national sovereignty, and thousands of small humiliations that rarely appeared in company brochures. At the top of the plantation hierarchy stood foreign managers and senior staff. Below them were clerks, technicians, foremen, skilled workers, and laborers. Status could determine where a person lived and which social spaces were open to him. In some company zones, physical geography itself reflected hierarchy. Management houses stood in better drained locations. Workers' barracks occupied less desirable ground. Offices were maintained carefully. Labor camps could be neglected. The landscape quietly announced who mattered. Banana production also changed the environment. Large areas were cleared. Drainage canals cut through lowlands. Rail lines reshaped movement. Rivers were altered. Monoculture replaced more diverse vegetation. The banana plant likes water, but not waterlogged roots, so companies invested heavily in drainage. Ditches and canals became as important as tracks. The tropical landscape was being redesigned around one crop. That crop was profitable because it was uniform. Uniformity made harvesting simpler. Uniform fruit suited shipping, but biological uniformity created vulnerability. If one plant was susceptible to a disease, thousands of similar plants might be susceptible too. At first, this risk seemed manageable. If a plantation became unproductive, companies could move. They owned land elsewhere. A new field could be cleared. Another railway spur could be laid. From a corporate viewpoint, geography itself became disposable. This had enormous consequences. When disease damaged land, a company did not always need to restore the soil or help surrounding communities adapt. It might abandon the area. Workers remained, families remained, towns remained, but the reason the railway existed had disappeared. A company that had seemed permanent could leave with astonishing speed once profit declined. This made banana districts strangely unstable. During a boom, people arrived, shops opened, houses were built, rail traffic increased, money circulated. Then disease, flood, market changes, or corporate strategy shifted production elsewhere. The town weakened, jobs vanished, tracks rusted, vegetation reclaimed abandoned structures, the banana created settlements and destroyed them with the same indifference. For workers, this meant that stability was always conditional. A man might spend years cutting fruit, only to discover that the plantation was closing. The company could move capital, he could not always move family. This imbalance became one reason labor organizing grew. Workers began demanding better wages, safer conditions, shorter hours, recognition of unions, access to independent stores rather than company monopolies. Protection from arbitrary dismissal, these demands were ordinary, they were also dangerous. A strike threatened more than a plantation manager's patience. It threatened the schedule. A stopped plantation meant fruit not cut. Fruit not cut meant trains not loaded. Trains not loaded meant ships delayed. Ships delayed meant shortages and financial losses. The entire banana system depended upon movement. A strike was therefore more dangerous to the company than a quiet complaint. And companies developed ways to resist. They dismissed organizers. They hired replacements. They pressured governments. They appealed for police protection. They argued that strikes threatened national exports. A labor dispute could quickly become a political crisis because the company had woven itself into the country's economy. Governments faced an uncomfortable choice: support workers and risk losing export revenue. Support the company and risk angering citizens. Weak governments often chose the side with ships. This deepened resentment. The company might be foreign, its profits often traveled abroad, its managers could leave. Workers remained in the country after the ship sailed. This difference mattered. To a local laborer, a banana plantation was home. To an executive, it was an asset. Those two understandings could coexist peacefully only while conditions were good. When wages fell or disease spread or land disputes intensified, the difference became obvious. Still, most days were not dramatic. Most days were work. That is easy to forget because history tends to remember strikes and massacres. It forgets Tuesdays. Yet the banana empire was built on Tuesdays, on men waking before dawn, on women washing clothes in humid settlements, on children walking beside railway tracks, on cooks preparing meals, on clerks recording shipments, on mechanics repairing locomotives, on dock workers lifting cargo, on nurses treating fever, on workers repeating the same movements until they became invisible to anyone looking from above. The company measured productivity. The worker measured fatigue. One entered the figure in a ledger. The other carried it home in his shoulders. The banana itself continued becoming cheaper in northern markets. That cheapness depended upon keeping costs low throughout the system. Every cent saved in wages, transport, packing, or loss could matter when millions of bananas were sold. Consumers appreciated the low price. They rarely asked why the fruit was so inexpensive. This was not unusual. Cheap goods have always encouraged selective blindness. When a product costs very little, people tend to assume it was easy to produce. The banana was the opposite. It was difficult to grow at industrial scale, difficult to move, difficult to protect from disease, difficult to coordinate. Its cheapness was an achievement of logistics and power. The worker absorbed part of that cost. So did governments through tax concessions. So did communities that gave up land. So did ecosystems converted into plantations. The supermarket price never told the entire story. By the early decades of the 20th century, banana companies had become deeply embedded in several Central American economies. Their railways could be indispensable. Their ports could dominate exports. Their payrolls supported entire districts. Their land holdings gave them extraordinary local influence. This created a paradox. A company might bring employment and infrastructure. The same company might become powerful enough to limit the government's ability to control it. Development and dependency grew together. Politicians understood the danger. Some tried to renegotiate concessions. Some attempted reforms. Others built close relationships with company representatives. Corruption certainly existed. So did genuine belief that foreign investment was necessary. Again, the story resists simplicity. Not every politician was a puppet. Not every company official was a villain. Not every worker hated the company. But the imbalance was real. A corporation with capital, lawyers, transport, and access to powerful foreign diplomats had advantages ordinary citizens did not. And once conflict began, those advantages mattered. Outside the tropics, the banana retained its innocent image. American families increasingly viewed it as ordinary nourishment. Nutrition advice praised fruit, advertisements made bananas appear cheerful and wholesome, recipes encouraged new uses, breakfast tables filled with yellow curves. The distance between the eater and the plantation widened emotionally even as transportation brought them closer geographically. This distance was useful to everyone who profited from the system. A banana without history is easy to enjoy. A banana connected to land disputes and labor conflict is less comfortable. So the history stayed far away, but workers knew it. They could see the railway. They knew who owned the houses. They knew where the managers lived. They knew what happened when organizers appeared. And gradually, across banana zones, labor resistance became harder to ignore. Strikes became larger, demands became more coordinated. Governments were forced to choose sides. Company officials began speaking of order. Workers began speaking of justice. These two words rarely mean the same thing. At night, the plantation settles. The heat softens slightly, insects continue humming. A worker lies beneath a thin roof listening to rain. Tomorrow he will return to the field. Perhaps nothing remarkable will happen. Perhaps the train will arrive on time. Perhaps the fruit will reach the ship. Perhaps the company books will record another successful day. But beneath the routine, pressure is building. The banana empire has learned how to command land. It has learned how to command ships. It has learned how to command railways. Now it must discover whether it can command people with the same certainty. And people, unlike bananas, do not always ripen according to schedule. Let us move away from the workers' quarters and follow the railway one step farther. Beyond the plantation, beyond the loading platforms, beyond the port, there is another place where the banana begins to matter: the government office. At first, the connection seems almost innocent. A company needs permission to build a railway. A government wants a railway. The company needs land. The government has land it considers undeveloped. The company wants lower taxes. The government wants investment. The company promises jobs. The government wants employment. A contract is signed. Everyone appears satisfied. Then the years pass. The railway becomes essential. Exports begin depending on it. Ports grow around it. Towns grow beside it. Thousands of workers rely upon wages connected to the company. Merchants rely upon company transport. Farmers rely upon access to company lines. Government revenue becomes tied to the export economy, and suddenly the agreement no longer feels equal. A private business has become part of the national skeleton. Removing it would hurt. Opposing it would be costly. Even regulating it might be difficult. This is how economic influence becomes political power, not always through bribery, not always through threats, sometimes simply through dependency. A government may dislike a company and still fear what would happen if the company left. That fear is useful. Banana companies understood it. Across parts of Central America, foreign fruit companies gained concessions involving land, railways, ports, taxation, and infrastructure. The exact arrangements differed from one country to another. Local politics mattered, presidents mattered, military leaders mattered, landowners mattered, foreign diplomats mattered. But one pattern appeared repeatedly. The company needed favorable conditions. The state needed investment. And over time, the company often became strong enough to influence the conditions under which it operated. The phrase that later became famous was Banana Republic. Today, it is often used casually, sometimes jokingly, sometimes as an insult for a corrupt or unstable state. But the historical idea came from a very real relationship between export dependence, foreign capital, weak institutions, and political instability. A country heavily dependent upon one crop is vulnerable. If the crop price falls, government revenue suffers. If the crop fails, employment suffers. If a foreign company controls much of the crop, then that company possesses leverage. The banana was particularly powerful because the industry required so much infrastructure. A coffee exporter might depend on roads and ports. A banana giant might own the road and the port. That is a different kind of influence. Imagine a minister sitting at a desk in a humid capital. Before him are papers relating to taxes, railways, land grants, labor disputes. The company's representatives have requested another concession. Perhaps they argue that expansion will create jobs. Perhaps they warn that investment could go elsewhere. Perhaps they remind the minister politely of how much national export revenue depends upon their operations. No weapon lies on the desk. No soldier stands in the room. Yet pressure is present. The government is negotiating with a business that may employ more people in certain districts than the state itself. That matters. The minister may sign. Another piece of land changes hands. Another tax exemption is granted. Another agreement lengthens the company's reach. To investors abroad, this can look like good business. To ordinary citizens, it can look like sovereignty being sold one contract at a time. The resentment is easy to understand. Foreign managers might live in comfortable houses. Company trains moved efficiently through regions where ordinary roads remained poor. Export facilities could be modern, while nearby villages lacked basic services. The contrast was visible. The country appeared to contain two different worlds, one connected to foreign markets, one left behind. The banana zone had electricity, telegraph lines, warehouses, locomotives, hospitals, and shipping schedules. Nearby communities might still depend on muddy roads and uncertain public services. The infrastructure existed, but it did not necessarily belong to everyone. This distinction became increasingly political. Reformers asked why so much land remained in foreign corporate hands. Workers asked why wages stayed low while exports grew. Politicians asked whether old concessions should be renegotiated. Company lawyers asked whether contracts would be honored. Every side claimed fairness. Every side understood that enormous sums of money were at stake. And behind all of it sat the banana. Soft, yellow, cheap, almost ridiculous. The political weight attached to it became easier to see during moments of crisis. A strike could threaten exports. A tax increase could threaten profits. A land reform program could threaten plantation acreage. A new government could threaten old agreements. When such threats appeared, companies did not remain passive. They cultivated relationships, they hired influential attorneys, they communicated with diplomats. They presented themselves as engines of development. They warned foreign governments that unstable local politics might endanger property and investment. These arguments carried weight, especially when the foreign company came from a powerful nation. The United States had growing strategic and economic interests throughout the Caribbean and Central America. American officials worried about trade routes. They worried about European influence. They worried about political instability. They worried about debts owed to foreign creditors. And American companies expected some degree of protection abroad. The result was a complicated relationship between private business and foreign policy. Not every intervention happened because of bananas. That would be too simple. Military strategy mattered. Canal routes mattered. Debt mattered. Domestic politics mattered. But fruit companies operated inside this larger system and benefited from it. When a company's interests aligned with a powerful government's interests, the difference between commercial pressure and state pressure could become difficult to see. This was especially true in countries where political institutions were already fragile. Presidents could be overthrown, military officers could become political leaders, elections could be disputed, regional rivalries could turn violent, foreign businesses preferred predictable governments. Predictability is profitable. A leader who honored contracts was useful. A leader who threatened land concessions was less so. This encouraged companies to care deeply about who held power. Once a corporation begins caring about presidents, it has traveled a long way from fruit. The banana itself had not changed. The business around it had the company town, now connected to the capital. The capital connected to foreign embassies. The embassies connected to Washington. The plantation worker carrying a bunch beneath tropical rain stood at the far end of a chain that reached into rooms where national policy was discussed. He might never know his work had any connection to diplomacy. The diplomat might never see the mud on the worker's boots. But the connection existed, the banana linked them. That link became particularly important when reform movements appeared. Across Latin America, political leaders and social movements periodically demanded changes to land ownership, labor rights, taxation, and foreign concessions. Some reforms were modest, others were ambitious. Banana companies viewed each through the language of risk. Would taxes increase? Would unused land be redistributed? Would workers gain stronger bargaining power? Would contracts be reviewed? Would railways be nationalized? Would export rules change? Every answer affected profit. And because these corporations possessed deep political connections, their concerns traveled far beyond the plantation office. Public relations became part of the business. A company did not want to be known as a foreign landholder with extraordinary influence over weak governments. It preferred the language of progress, development, jobs, modernization, infrastructure, commerce, order. These words were not entirely false. That is what made them useful. Banana companies really did build railways, they really did employ thousands, they really did operate hospitals and schools, they really did connect remote regions to global markets. The problem was not that nothing good happened. The problem was that the company usually decided which improvements were worth making. A railway existed where fruit needed to move. A port expanded where ships needed to dock. A hospital appeared where workers needed to remain productive. Public benefit and private profit overlapped, but they were not the same thing. Governments that became too dependent on foreign companies could struggle to separate the two. This is where the phrase banana republic gained its darker meaning. The country exports fruit. The company owns the transport. The political elite depends on export revenue. The army protects order. Workers demand change. Foreign diplomats demand stability. And somewhere outside the country, consumers buy bananas at low prices without seeing any of it. The system rewards calm at the top. It may produce misery below. Sometimes that calm breaks. Workers organize. Students protest. Politicians campaign against foreign influence. New leaders promise reform. Landless families demand access to unused property. Nationalists ask why a corporation possesses so much territory. The company hears danger in every demand, not because every reform would destroy the business, but because uncertainty is expensive. Corporations prefer rules that remain unchanged. History rarely cooperates. One of the most famous examples would eventually occur in Guatemala. There, the question of land reform collided directly with the interests of the United Fruit Company. The company held large areas of land, not all of which were actively cultivated. Reformers argued that unused estates could be redistributed to landless farmers, to supporters. This was an attempt to correct extreme inequality. To opponents, it threatened private property. To United Fruit, it threatened company assets. The conflict would grow far beyond a disagreement about acreage. But before reaching that crisis, it is worth understanding why land mattered so much. Banana plantations needed flexibility. Disease could ruin one area. Floods could damage another. Companies therefore valued reserve land. What looked unused to a reformer might look strategically essential to a corporation. Both descriptions could be true. The dispute was not merely about whether the land had banana plants growing on it that year. It was about who had the right to decide what the land was for. That is a political question. And once bananas became tied to land rights, rail monopolies, labor law, and national revenue, the fruit could no longer pretend to be merely agricultural. It had entered the state. The political atmosphere in banana countries could be strange. Company representatives attended formal meetings with ministers. Managers maintained friendships with officials. Lawyers negotiated concessions. Local politicians depended on business support. Workers understood that complaints against the company might become complaints against authorities as well. This made resistance difficult. A worker challenging his employer might also find himself confronting police. A farmer contesting a land claim might face company lawyers and government bureaucracy at the same time. The difference between corporate power and state power blurred. And yet, this power was never absolute. Workers still struck, governments still resisted, courts sometimes ruled against companies, political movements grew. The banana empire was powerful precisely because it had to keep defending itself. A truly uncontested system needs little persuasion. United Fruit and its rivals invested so much effort in political relationships because those relationships could change. A new president could rewrite the rules. A new labor law could increase costs. A new tax could reduce profits. A new land policy could threaten reserves. The companies were strong. They were also afraid. That fear shaped their behavior. They preferred governments that valued stability over reform. They preferred officials who believed foreign investment should be protected. They preferred labor forces that remained divided. They preferred newspapers that praised development. They preferred citizens who associated the banana industry with prosperity rather than domination. When those preferences were challenged, conflict followed. Meanwhile, the consumer image grew brighter. Bananas became an increasingly ordinary feature of American life. The fruit appeared in advertisements as wholesome and cheerful. It belonged in kitchens, lunches, desserts, breakfast. The political banana and the domestic banana seemed like different objects. One was connected to presidents, railways, police, land concessions, and foreign policy. The other was sliced into a bowl. This separation was extraordinary. A commodity could sit at the center of international disputes while remaining culturally innocent. The customer peeled away the skin. History stayed attached to the part thrown into the bin. Perhaps that is why the banana became such a perfect symbol. It looked harmless enough to hide power. The tropical world could be reduced to a cheerful piece of fruit. The labor disappeared. The land disputes disappeared. The political pressure disappeared. What remained was sweetness, but inside the banana kingdoms nobody could forget so easily. The railway belonged to someone. The plantation belonged to someone. The port belonged to someone. The land had been granted by someone. The police answered to someone, and workers began asking whether the country itself still belonged to them. These questions became sharper during periods of economic crisis. When prices fell, companies cut costs. Jobs disappeared. Wages came under pressure. Governments lost revenue. Political resentment grew. A system that seemed stable during profitable years could become fragile very quickly. The banana had created dependence on both sides. Countries depended on exports. Companies depended on political cooperation. Workers depended on wages. Consumers depended on cheap supply. Everyone wanted the system to continue. Nobody agreed on who should control it. That disagreement could turn violent. In some places, strikes were suppressed. In others, soldiers were deployed. In still others, governments fell amid broader struggles in which foreign business interests played an important role. The myth of the Banana Republic often imagines ridiculous little countries controlled entirely by fruit companies. The reality was more complicated and more disturbing. These were real societies with real political movements, real debates, real workers, real landowners, real soldiers, and real citizens. Foreign corporations did not erase local politics, they entered it. They amplified some forces, weakened others, rewarded certain leaders, feared certain reforms, and occasionally called upon powerful friends abroad. That was enough. A company did not need to own a country in the legal sense. It only needed enough influence to make governments think carefully before saying no. That is a quieter form of control. And quiet control often lasts longer. Night falls over the capital. Government offices empty. A clerk closes a ledger. A minister leaves behind a stack of contracts. Across town, company representatives finish dinner. Far away, a train moves toward the coast, carrying another load of green fruit. Nothing dramatic happens. No flag changes. No army marches. Yet the balance of power shifts slightly with every agreement. Another concession, another favor, another railway extension, another year in which the country depends on exports controlled by interests beyond its borders. The banana has become more than cargo now. It has become leverage. And leverage, unlike fruit, does not rot. In the years ahead, workers will test that leverage through strikes. Reformers will test it through law. Governments will test it through taxation and land policy. And foreign powers will decide how far they are willing to go to protect the system. The fruit on the breakfast table remains soft. The politics around it are becoming harder by the day. Now we move from government offices back toward the railway yards. The contracts have been signed, the land has been granted, the trains are running, the ships are loading. From a distance, the system appears stable. But stability is often only the name given to pressure before it breaks. Inside the banana zones, workers had begun to understand something important. The company needed them. It could own land, it could own locomotives, it could own warehouses, docks, ships, and telegraph lines. But bananas still had to be cut by human hands. Trains still had to be loaded, rails still had to be repaired, fruit still had to be carried through mud. A plantation without labor was only a field of ripening loss. This gave workers power. Not enough power to make them equal to the companies, but enough to become dangerous when they acted together. A single worker who refused to cut fruit could be replaced. 1,000 workers who refused at the same time created a different problem. This was the logic behind the strike. It was also why companies feared strikes so intensely. The banana industry operated on time. Delay was expensive. A copper mine might temporarily store its product. A banana company could not simply tell the harvest to remain green until the dispute ended. Fruit kept ripening, ships kept arriving. Contracts still demanded delivery. A strike attacked the industry at its weakest point, the clock. Workers knew this, so did managers. Across banana-producing regions, labor disputes became increasingly common during the early decades of the 20th century. The complaints varied from place to place, but certain demands appeared again and again. Better wages, more reliable payment, shorter working days, safer conditions, compensation for injuries, improved housing, freedom from abusive foremen, recognition of organized labor, an end to company practices that made workers dependent on company stores or subcontractors. To modern ears, many of these demands sound ordinary. At the time, they could be treated as threats to the entire commercial order. The problem was not merely that higher wages reduced profit. The greater fear was that organized workers could force the company to negotiate. That changed the balance of power. A manager accustomed to giving instructions suddenly faced representatives who claimed to speak for thousands. A government accustomed to protecting export activity faced citizens asking whether it protected them as well. The banana was becoming political from below. One of the most infamous labor conflicts associated with the banana trade occurred in Colombia. Along the Caribbean coast, the banana industry had expanded around the region of Santa Marta. United Fruit had become a major commercial presence. Workers labored on plantations and in related transport systems under arrangements that produced growing dissatisfaction. By the late 1920s, tension had become severe. Workers demanded reforms. They challenged employment practices. They wanted clearer contracts and better conditions. A large strike began. For the workers, this was a labor dispute. For the company, it threatened production. For the Colombian government, it became a question of order. These three descriptions pointed toward the same railway lines. Crowds gathered. Negotiations failed. The atmosphere hardened. The government deployed troops. What followed became one of the darkest episodes in the history of the banana industry. Near the town of Ciénaga, striking workers and their families gathered while troops were present. Then soldiers opened fire. The exact number of people killed became disputed and remains uncertain. That uncertainty itself tells us something. Official counts, eyewitness accounts, political claims, and later memories differed sharply. Some estimates were relatively low. Others described a death toll reaching far higher. What is certain is simpler: people died. A labor conflict over a fruit company had ended with soldiers firing upon civilians. The banana had become dangerous in a very literal sense. Not because anyone was struck by a falling bunch, because an export system had become important enough that disrupting it was treated as a national emergency. The massacre entered Colombian memory. Years later, it would appear transformed through literature and political debate. The details became part of a larger argument about foreign power, government responsibility, and the value placed on workers' lives. For people outside Colombia, however, bananas remained inexpensive. This contrast is difficult to escape. A customer in a northern city could buy the fruit without knowing that workers elsewhere had died in a conflict tied to its production. Nothing on the peel carried that information. There was no warning label, no history lesson attached to the bunch, only yellow skin. That silence was convenient. The banana business benefited from distance. Physical distance separated the consumer from the plantation. Cultural distance separated comfort from labor. Political distance separated breakfast from bloodshed. The same pattern could be seen elsewhere, although not always with the same outcome. Strikes appeared in other banana regions. Sometimes they ended through negotiation. Sometimes workers won concessions. Sometimes organizers were dismissed. Sometimes police or soldiers broke gatherings. Sometimes political leaders tried to mediate. The details changed. The basic conflict remained. Companies wanted predictable labor. Workers wanted dignity and bargaining power. Predictability and dignity are not always enemies. But under unequal systems, they can become so. The banana companies often relied on contractors and complicated employment arrangements. This could make responsibility difficult to establish. A company might argue that certain laborers were not technically its employees. Workers who spent their days producing company fruit could discover that, on paper, they belonged to someone else. This was useful when disputes arose. Responsibility could travel in circles. The worker answered to a contractor. The contractor answered to the company. The company claimed distance. The fruit moved anyway. Such arrangements frustrated organizing. Who should negotiate? Who should pay compensation? Who was legally responsible? These questions mattered most to people who had the least access to lawyers. Meanwhile, governments faced pressure from several directions. Workers were citizens. Companies were major investors. Exports brought foreign currency. Foreign diplomats watched closely. Military officers worried about disorder. Politicians worried about opponents exploiting unrest. A strike in a banana district could therefore become far larger than the original workplace dispute. It could become an argument over national identity. Was the government protecting its people or protecting foreign capital? Was the company creating prosperity or extracting wealth? Were labor organizers reformers or dangerous radicals? The language used depended heavily on who was speaking. During the early 20th century, fear of socialism and communism increasingly shaped how labor movements were viewed. Company representatives and political elites could describe organizers as revolutionary threats. Workers could describe themselves as people asking for ordinary rights. Sometimes both radical politics and ordinary wage demands existed within the same movement. History rarely keeps its categories tidy, but labeling labor unrest as subversion had one useful effect for powerful institutions: it justified stronger responses. A wage dispute could be treated as a security problem. A security problem could justify soldiers. And once soldiers arrive, the conversation changes. The banana zones had always depended upon discipline. Plantations followed schedules, trains followed schedules, ships followed schedules. The workforce was expected to fit into the same pattern. But people are not rail wagons. They bring memories, anger, hope, fear, family obligations, political ideas, resentment. One foreman's insult can matter. One unpaid wage can matter. One injury without compensation can matter. Years of small grievances can collect until the first day of a strike feels almost inevitable. The company may see that strike as sudden. The workers usually do not. In company reports, labor unrest might appear as a disruption. To the people participating, it might be the result of a lifetime. This gap in perception made conflict harder to resolve. Management viewed the plantation as a system. Workers viewed it as life. The company could move production. The worker could not easily move his past. This difference became especially painful when entire banana districts were abandoned. Disease sometimes made older plantations unprofitable. Companies shifted toward new land. Rail lines that had once carried constant freight became quieter. Jobs disappeared. The same corporation that had shaped a town could suddenly have little reason to remain. Workers who had trusted the permanence of the banana economy learned that corporate geography was temporary. Land was valuable only while it served the system. People did not have the same flexibility, so labor struggles were also struggles for security. A worker did not merely want higher pay today. He wanted some assurance that tomorrow existed. Companies rarely promised that. They could not. The banana itself made permanence difficult. Diseases moved through plantations, soil conditions changed, storms destroyed crops. Markets shifted. A rational corporation kept alternatives. A worker often had none. By the 1930s, the Great Depression added another layer of strain. Global trade contracted. Commodity prices suffered. Employment became more uncertain. Governments faced economic crisis. Banana companies adjusted production. For workers already living close to poverty, economic contraction could be devastating. The fruit remained in northern stores, but behind every stable retail display lay unstable producing regions. This is one reason the banana industry developed such extraordinary control over land. Companies wanted options. If one region became expensive or politically troublesome, another might be developed. If disease entered one plantation, untouched land could replace it. If workers organized too successfully in one district, moving operations elsewhere was at least conceivable. Mobility strengthened the company, immobility weakened the worker, and so the banana kingdoms remained restless. Yet it would be wrong to imagine workers as permanently powerless. Organizing did produce change, labor movements grew, political parties incorporated worker demands, governments gradually enacted reforms, trade unions became more capable in many regions. Companies learned that endless repression could also be expensive. A workforce living in permanent hostility was difficult to manage. Negotiations sometimes became preferable. The balance shifted slowly, never evenly, but it shifted. The banana zones also produced their own political leaders, journalists, teachers, union organizers, and intellectuals. People who lived within these company landscapes understood them in ways foreign observers often did not. They knew both sides. They knew that company railways could be useful. They knew that company hospitals could save lives. They also knew what dependency felt like. This made their political arguments more complicated than simple opposition to foreign investment. Many wanted development. They simply wanted development that did not require surrendering control. That question would soon become central in Guatemala. There, a government would attempt a major program of social and economic reform. Land would become the most explosive issue. United Fruit would find itself confronting a political movement that did not merely want higher wages or better housing. It wanted to change the structure beneath the plantations that frightened the company far more than a temporary strike. A strike could end. Land reform could permanently change ownership, and ownership was the foundation of everything. Before reaching Guatemala, however, there is one more detail to notice. The banana companies were becoming experts in storytelling, not bedtime storytelling. Political storytelling. They learned how to describe themselves to journalists, governments, investors, and consumers. They were not foreign monopolies. They were developers. They were not defending privilege. They were defending property. They were not opposing workers. They were preserving stability. They were not controlling weak states. They were supporting modernization. Again, none of these claims was entirely false. That made them powerful. The strongest propaganda often contains enough truth to feel reasonable. Companies really had modernized transportation. They really had created employment. They really had invested capital in difficult regions. But one could acknowledge all of that and still ask who benefited most. That question became increasingly difficult to silence. Workers asked it. Reformers asked it. Nationalists asked it. Foreign critics asked it. Even some politicians who had once welcomed company investment began asking it. By now, bananas had existed in the region long enough for the first generation of optimism to fade. The railway no longer looked miraculous simply because it existed. People wanted to know where it went, who could use it, who profited from it, who had paid for it in land, who had died building it. Progress becomes less impressive when people begin calculating its price. The banana empire had spent decades building physical infrastructure. Now it needed to defend the story that made that infrastructure legitimate. This would become increasingly difficult. At the plantation level, however, another workday still began before dawn. A man woke. He dressed. He stepped outside. The air was wet. Perhaps he had heard rumors of a strike in another district. Perhaps he knew an organizer. Perhaps he distrusted unions. Perhaps he simply needed his wages. History tends to place everyone into camps after the fact. Real people often begin the morning uncertain. The worker walks toward the field. Above him, The leaves move in the early wind. The banana bunches hang green and heavy. A train waits somewhere beyond the plants. The routine appears unchanged, but the world surrounding the routine has shifted. Workers now know that the company can be challenged. Companies know that workers can stop the clock. Governments know that labor disputes can become national crises. And foreign observers know that a fruit company's problems can become matters of diplomacy. The banana has become dangerous in another way. It has created a system so tightly connected that a dispute in one muddy plantation can reach a cabinet room hundreds of miles away. Soon that reach will extend even farther. Into intelligence offices, into newspapers, into foreign policy, and into one of the most controversial political interventions ever associated with a piece of fruit. For now, the fields are quiet. The workers begin cutting. The train begins moving. The ship waits at the coast, but beneath the ordinary machinery of another working day, the banana kingdoms have learned something they will not forget. A company can own land, it can own railways, it can influence governments. But when people decide they have had enough, even the most efficient system can suddenly stop. Let us leave the plantation railway behind and travel north into Guatemala. The landscape changes slowly. Low tropical country rises toward mountains. Volcanoes stand above valleys. Villages cling to slopes. Coffee grows in the highlands. Far below, toward the Caribbean, humid land stretches toward the sea. Here, the banana had become part of something much larger than agriculture. United Fruit possessed extensive interests in Guatemala. The company controlled plantations. It had access to important transportation networks. Its influence touched railways, port facilities, shipping, and communications. To its executives, Guatemala was an important piece of a commercial system. To many Guatemalans, however, the country had a deeper problem: land. Large estates dominated much of the countryside. At the same time, many rural families possessed little land of their own. This inequality was not created by the banana companies alone. Its roots reached far deeper into Guatemala's colonial history and political structure. But large foreign landholdings became an especially visible symbol of the problem. For generations, political power had often served wealthy landowners. Rural laborers, many of them indigenous Maya, lived within systems that offered little economic security. Then Guatemala entered a period of political change. A popular movement challenged the old dictatorship. Elections followed. Reformers spoke about democracy, education, labor rights, and modernization. For people who had lived under authoritarian government, the atmosphere carried unusual possibility. The country seemed to be asking a dangerous question. What if the rules could change? Eventually, Jacobo Arbenz became president. Arbenz believed Guatemala needed economic independence and modernization. Land reform became one of the central parts of his program. The logic was straightforward. Large estates held substantial areas of land that were not being cultivated. Many rural families had little or none. The government proposed taking certain unused portions of large properties, compensating the owners, and redistributing land to peasants. To supporters, this was overdue reform. To large landowners, it was threatening. To United Fruit, it was extremely threatening. The company possessed extensive landholdings, some of which were not under active cultivation. There were commercial reasons for holding reserves. Banana agriculture was vulnerable. Disease could force production into new areas. Flooding could damage plantations. Unused land could therefore have future value. But the Guatemalan government saw idle acreage differently. To officials carrying out land reform, land that was not being cultivated could be redistributed. The conflict moved quickly from theory to property. Government authorities expropriated portions of United Fruit land under the reform program. Compensation was offered according to declared tax values, and here the situation became awkward. For tax purposes, companies had reasons to value property conservatively. When compensation was calculated using those values, United Fruit argued that the land was worth far more. The difference was enormous. A number written conveniently low for taxation suddenly became painfully low when the government offered to pay it. It would almost be funny if the consequences were not so serious, United Fruit protested. The company had influential connections in the United States. Its concerns reached lawyers, officials, journalists, and policymakers. But the banana was only one part of what Washington saw. This was the early Cold War. American officials viewed political change through an increasingly anxious lens. The Soviet Union was an enemy. Communist movements were treated not simply as domestic political actors, but as possible extensions of a global strategic threat. Reform governments could therefore become suspicious if communists participated in their political coalitions. Guatemala contained communist activists and advisors with influence in parts of the labor and reform movement. Arbenz was not simply a puppet taking orders from Moscow. Guatemalan politics was more complicated than that. But complexity performs poorly when governments are frightened. American officials increasingly described Guatemala as a communist danger. United Fruit had every reason to encourage a hostile interpretation of the Arbenz government. Its property was threatened, its position in the country was threatened, and a successful land reform program might inspire similar movements elsewhere. The company had something many Guatemalan peasants did not access. Executives and attorneys could reach powerful people in the United States. Public relations specialists could shape press coverage. Lobbyists could present the company's case. The conflict over land could be described not merely as a dispute between a government and a corporation, but as evidence of communist expansion in the Western Hemisphere. This framing mattered. Words prepare the ground long before soldiers arrive. If Guatemala was merely a poor country attempting land reform, intervention would be difficult to justify. If Guatemala was becoming a Soviet foothold near the United States, the story changed. The same government could be seen through two entirely different narratives. One emphasized reform, the other emphasized communism. Both pointed to real features of Guatemalan politics. Neither alone captured the whole picture. But foreign policy rarely waits for perfect historical balance. The administration of President Dwight Eisenhower became increasingly convinced that Arbenz had to go. The Central Intelligence Agency prepared a covert operation aimed at overthrowing the Guatemalan government. The plan relied on psychological pressure, propaganda, diplomatic isolation, and a relatively small force led by the exiled Guatemalan officer Carlos Castillo Armas. The operation did not require defeating Guatemala in a conventional war. It needed to convince enough people that Arbenz could not survive. Fear would do much of the work. Radio broadcasts spread claims and rumors. Military pressure increased. Aircraft carried out limited attacks. The invading force itself was not overwhelmingly powerful. But the appearance of unstoppable momentum mattered. Inside Guatemala, uncertainty spread through the military and government. Would the United States intervene more openly? Would resistance lead to a larger war? Could Arbenz trust his officers? Could the government arm civilians without creating another crisis? These questions weakened the regime. In the summer of 1954, Arbenz resigned. Castillo Armas eventually took power. The reform era collapsed. Land reform was reversed. United Fruit recovered from the immediate threat to its holdings. The episode became one of the defining examples of Cold War intervention in Latin America. And because United Fruit had been so deeply involved in the conflict surrounding land reform, the coup became permanently linked to the history of bananas. It is tempting to tell the story too neatly. A fruit company wanted land. The company ordered a coup. The government fell. End of story. History was not quite that simple. American officials had genuine Cold War fears. Some sincerely believed communist influence in Guatemala posed a strategic danger. Guatemalan political factions had their own interests. The military made its own calculations. Local landowners opposed reform for reasons unrelated to bananas. The CIA operated according to broader American policy. United Fruit did not single-handedly command the United States government. But none of this makes the company irrelevant. Its interests mattered. Its lobbying mattered. Its public relations efforts mattered. Its connections mattered. And the land dispute helped transform an already tense political relationship into a crisis. The banana was not the only cause. It was woven into the causes. That distinction matters. For a sleepy history story about fruit, we have traveled an astonishing distance. We began with wild plants containing hard seeds. Then farmers selected softer fruit. The plant crossed oceans, Merchants discovered how difficult the fruit was to transport. Steamships solved part of the problem, railways solved another. Companies acquired land to feed those railways. Land created political influence. Political influence became entangled with national policy. And now a dispute involving banana land had become part of the overthrow of a government. The progression sounds almost absurd when placed in a single line. Yet, that is how economic systems grow. One practical solution creates the need for another, then another, until eventually the original problem is almost forgotten. The original problem was simple. How do you move a banana before it rots? The solution became an empire. For ordinary Guatemalans, the coup was not an amusing historical curiosity. Its consequences stretched far beyond United Fruit. The political settlement that followed weakened democratic reform and reinforced authoritarian forces. Over the following decades, Guatemala would descend into prolonged internal conflict. The civil war that developed later had many causes and cannot be reduced to the events surrounding the banana company. But the overthrow of Arbans became an important turning point. Political violence deepened, repression intensified. Rural and indigenous communities would suffer terribly during the decades ahead. A breakfast fruit had brushed against a history of enormous human pain. Again, the peel showed none of it. In the United States, bananas remained bananas. They were cheap, nutritious, convenient. Children ate them, families sliced them over cereal. Advertisements presented tropical abundance without tropical politics. Most consumers had little reason to connect a banana in the kitchen with a president, forced from office in Guatemala. That distance protected the product. It also protected the company's public image. This was an age before consumers could instantly see photographs from plantations or read foreign newspapers at home. Information traveled through newspapers, radio, magazines, government statements, and corporate publicity. Whoever shaped the story had considerable power. United Fruit understood this unusually well. The company had worked with public relations experts who helped cultivate favorable relationships with journalists and opinion makers. Trips could be arranged, information supplied, company development projects highlighted. The corporation could present itself as a modernizing force, bringing railways, hospitals, employment, and trade to tropical countries. Again, these things existed. The trick was deciding what not to mention: unused land, tax privileges, labor conflict, political influence. A good public image is often built from selective truth rather than obvious lies. The banana became a master of selective truth. Its public story was sunshine. Its private history was paperwork, contracts, maps, land titles, lobbying, diplomatic cables, labor reports, and occasionally weapons after the Guatemalan coup. The idea that foreign corporations could possess dangerous political influence in Latin America became even harder to dismiss. Critics saw United Fruit as a symbol of economic imperialism. Supporters argued that the company was being unfairly blamed for larger Cold War conflicts. Both arguments would continue for decades. Meanwhile, the banana business itself faced a problem that no president could solve. No intelligence agency could overthrow it. No public relations campaign could persuade it to disappear. No favorable government could sign it away. The enemy was microscopic. It lived in the soil. For years, banana growers had been watching plantations become sick. Plants weakened, leaves yellowed. Entire fields lost productivity. The disease moved slowly enough that companies could escape at first, abandon one plantation, clear another, build another rail spur, plant fresh land, continue shipping, but every retreat cost money, and the enemy followed. The great banana empire had learned to manage workers. It had learned to negotiate with governments. It had learned to influence politics. Now it faced something entirely indifferent to money. A fungus does not care how many lawyers a company employs. It does not read contracts. It does not fear soldiers. It cannot be persuaded by advertising. It simply spreads. And the very thing that made the banana industry efficient made it vulnerable: uniformity. The plantations were filled with plants that were extraordinarily similar. The fruit looked the same, ripened similarly, traveled similarly. Customers knew what to expect. For business, this was ideal. For disease, it was an invitation. The dominant export banana of the era was the Gros Michel. Consumers knew its taste, even if they rarely knew its name. It traveled well. Its thick skin helped it survive shipping. Companies had built much of their commercial system around it. Plantations grew vast numbers of genetically similar plants. Then, Panama disease entered the roots. Once established in soil, it was extraordinarily difficult to remove. A plantation could become unusable for the susceptible variety. There was no political negotiation available. The company could own every railway in the country and still lose the field. This was a different kind of danger. For decades, businessmen had behaved as though land were replaceable. When disease arrived, they moved. But suitable land was not infinite. Each abandoned plantation pushed the industry toward another district. More forest might be cleared, more drainage dug, more tracks laid, more communities disrupted. The banana empire had been expanding, partly because it was running away, and now the disease was catching up. Perhaps there is a quiet justice in that, not moral justice. Plants do not administer morality, but historical irony. The companies had accumulated extraordinary political power because they needed to control every part of the banana system. Yet the most serious threat to the system came from the one thing they could not control: biology. The fruit had made governments nervous. Now the fruit companies were nervous. In a plantation somewhere in the tropics, a worker notices a leaf beginning to yellow. There is nothing dramatic about it. No soldiers, no radio broadcasts, no president resigning. Only a leaf, then another. The plant begins to wilt. Below the ground, invisible to everyone passing on the railway, the fungus is already doing its work. The company that helped influence the fate of governments is about to discover how little influence it has over the soil. The banana has survived ships, storms, strikes, political revolutions, and the impatience of millions of customers. Its next enemy will be much quieter and far more difficult to overthrow. Let us leave the government palaces behind, leave the lawyers, leave the diplomats, leave the men who believed every problem could be solved with influence, money, or another favorable agreement. We return to the plantation. The morning is damp. A worker walks between rows of banana plants and notices that one does not look right. The leaves are beginning to yellow. At first, this is easy to ignore. Plants suffer for many reasons. Too much water, too little water. Wind, poor soil, damage to the roots. But this plant does not recover. The yellow spreads, the leaves begin to wilt. Soon another plant shows the same signs. Then another. Beneath the ground, something is moving, not quickly, not visibly, but with far more patience than any corporation. Panama disease became one of the great biological disasters of the banana industry. The disease is caused by a soil-borne fungus that attacks the plant through its roots. Once inside, it interferes with the banana plant's ability to move water through its tissues. The plant begins to weaken, leaves yellow and collapse. Eventually, the entire plant may die. The most frightening part is what remains after the visible plant is gone. The soil itself can remain contaminated. A company cannot simply cut down the sick plants, burn them, and begin again with the same vulnerable variety. The enemy is still there, waiting. This was especially disastrous because the export banana industry had become heavily dependent on one particular variety. Gros Michel. To the modern shopper, the name may sound almost mysterious. For an earlier generation, its fruit was ordinary. Gros Michel bananas were well suited to the shipping systems of their day. They had thick skins, they handled transport relatively well. They could survive the rough journey from tropical plantation to northern market better than many alternatives. They were sweet, they were dependable, companies loved them, consumers learned to expect them. And enormous plantations were planted with nearly identical Gros Michel plants. This was efficient. That efficiency became a trap. Cultivated export bananas are commonly propagated through shoots rather than seeds. A grower takes a new plant from an existing one. The next plant is genetically very similar. Do this repeatedly across vast plantations, and the result is remarkable uniformity. One plant behaves like another. The fruit ripens similarly. The bunches can be handled similarly. The entire commercial system becomes easier to predict. But if one plant is vulnerable to a disease, its neighbors may be vulnerable in nearly the same way. The plantation becomes a banquet laid out for the pathogen. Panama disease did not need to adapt to hundreds of different genetic defenses. It encountered field after field of familiar victims. Once the fungus entered a plantation, the future could become grim. There was no easy chemical cure. The company could not negotiate with the fungus. It could not raise wages to satisfy it. It could not send soldiers into the soil. It could not offer tax exemptions. Its political power suddenly looked strangely useless. So companies did what wealthy companies often do when a place becomes inconvenient. They moved. A diseased plantation could be abandoned. New land could be cleared elsewhere. Fresh grow Michel plants could be established in uncontaminated soil. Railways might be extended. Drainage systems dug. Workers relocated. For a time, this strategy worked. The banana empire retreated from one patch of land and expanded into another. From the perspective of the company, this was adaptation. From the perspective of the landscape, it could be devastation. More forest was cleared, more land was claimed, more railway lines were pushed through tropical lowlands. More communities found themselves living beside another plantation frontier. The disease therefore shaped geography. A microscopic organism helped determine where people worked, where companies invested, where tracks were built, where towns grew, where towns later declined. It is a reminder that history is not created by human beings alone. Presidents matter, businessmen matter, workers matter, but fungi also matter. Rivers matter, mosquitoes matter, rainfall matters. Sometimes the smallest participant in a historical system has the largest effect. Panama disease spread through contaminated soil and infected planting material. Mud could carry it. Water could carry it. Tools and machinery could help move contaminated material. Human attempts to manage plantations sometimes assisted the disease without anyone realizing it. The very infrastructure that made banana production efficient could help connect vulnerable fields. For managers, the problem became increasingly difficult to escape. Imagine an office overlooking a plantation. On the desk sits a map. Some areas are marked as productive, others are marked as damaged. More land must be found. Surveyors are sent out, managers discuss costs, a railway extension is proposed, another district looks promising. The company knows how to do this. It has done it before, but the map contains an uncomfortable truth. Every move is temporary. The fungus does not disappear merely because production changes location. The industry is running from a biological enemy while pretending expansion is victory. This could continue only while fresh land remained available. And fresh land came with political problems. Some belonged to private owners. Some was used by rural communities. Some was forest. Some was difficult to drain. Some stood too far from transportation. The banana companies had accumulated large land reserves partly because they understood how useful mobility could be. Disease made those reserves even more valuable. This also deepened political resentment. To a company, unused land was insurance. To a landless farmer, it was land being wasted. The biological crisis and the political crisis were therefore connected. A corporation could argue that it needed enormous reserves because disease might destroy current plantations. A reformer could argue that families needed land now. Both looked at the same empty acreage and saw entirely different futures. Meanwhile, consumers in the north remained mostly unaware. Bananas continued arriving. The company did not advertise disease. A supermarket display did not carry a small sign explaining that the fruit industry was abandoning entire regions because a fungus had entered the soil. The achievement of the banana companies was maintaining the illusion of continuity. To the customer, nothing changed. A banana was available yesterday. A banana was available today. A banana would presumably be available tomorrow. Behind that simple expectation, entire landscapes were shifting. This expectation became a kind of tyranny. Once millions of customers considered bananas ordinary, the industry could not easily say that the fruit had become difficult to produce. It had to continue. Supply had to continue. The price had to remain low. The shape had to remain familiar. The taste had to remain familiar. The banana had ceased to be merely a crop. It had become a promise. And promises are expensive when biology refuses to cooperate. Companies experimented. Researchers studied disease. Growers searched for resistant varieties. The ideal replacement needed several qualities at once. It had to resist the disease. It had to produce acceptable fruit. The fruit had to travel well. It had to ripen in a predictable way. It had to survive handling. And perhaps most difficult of all, customers had to accept it. Agriculture and marketing had become inseparable. A botanically excellent banana was useless if shoppers rejected it. A delicious banana was useless if it collapsed during transport. A sturdy banana was useless if disease killed the plant. The industry needed a compromise. Eventually, attention turned toward a group of bananas known as Cavendish. Cavendish varieties were not new. They had been cultivated long before the crisis reached its peak, but they possessed one quality that suddenly mattered more than almost anything else. They were resistant to the form of Panama disease devastating Gros Michel plantations. The answer seemed almost miraculous. Replace the vulnerable banana, continue the industry. The practical reality was far less simple. The entire supply chain had been designed around Gros Michel. Cavendish fruit behaved differently. Its bunches were not identical. Its handling requirements differed. Packing methods needed adjustment. Shipping systems had to change. Plantations had to be replanted. Customers had to receive a banana that was familiar enough to be accepted, but different enough to survive the disease. An empire built around standardization had to standardize itself all over again. This transformation took years. There was no single morning when everyone stopped growing Gros Michel and planted Cavendish instead. Different regions changed at different times. Old plantations continued producing where disease had not yet destroyed them. New plantings expanded. Companies tested methods. Packing shifted increasingly toward boxed fruit rather than transporting giant bunches in older ways. Handling improved. Refrigeration and controlled ripening became more sophisticated. The banana industry reinvented itself while trying to make the consumer believe nothing important had happened. That may be one of its greatest commercial achievements. A customer accustomed to bananas continued buying bananas. The variety changed, the production system changed, the packaging changed, the disease map changed. The customer mostly did not notice. The yellow curve remained. Cavendish became the new ordinary, and once again uniformity followed. This was understandable. Companies wanted a banana they could predict. Growers wanted plants that produced familiar fruit. Retailers wanted consistency. Consumers wanted the banana they recognized. So vast areas were planted with Cavendish varieties. The industry escaped one genetic trap by constructing another one. For a while, that seemed perfectly sensible. The disease-threatening Gros Michel did not affect Cavendish in the same way. The new banana spread across export plantations. Old fields disappeared. New fields took their place. The crisis seemed defeated, but only if one forgot the lesson. The danger had never been simply Gros Michel. The danger was dependence on sameness. A plantation filled with genetically similar plants offers enormous commercial advantages. It also offers a pathogen an enormous opportunity. The banana industry had solved the immediate disease problem without fully solving the structural one. Perhaps it could not. A global supermarket system wants uniformity. Customers expect fruit of a certain color, a certain length, a certain curve, a certain texture. Importers need bananas that survive shipping. Ripening facilities need predictable behavior. Retailers want the fruit to mature on schedule. Biological diversity is wonderfully useful in nature. It can be frustrating in a warehouse, and so commerce tends to push towards sameness. The banana became one of the clearest examples of this tension. What is good for logistics can be bad for resilience. What is good for advertising can be bad for genetics. What is good for short-term efficiency can become dangerous over decades. The Gros Michel crisis had proved this with extraordinary clarity. Yet the new system once again became dependent on one dominant banana, Cavendish. The irony is almost perfect. An industry nearly destroyed by monoculture survives by creating another monoculture. At first, nobody needed to worry very much. Cavendish worked, plantations produced, ships sailed, markets remained full. The banana became more deeply embedded in everyday life. Prices stayed low. Production expanded. The memory of the Gros Michel disaster slowly faded from popular awareness. Older people might remember that bananas once tasted slightly different. Some stories claimed the old variety was richer or sweeter. Memory added its usual generosity. The lost banana became almost legendary. Whether every nostalgic comparison was accurate mattered less than the fact that an entire commercial variety had largely disappeared from global export markets. The fruit that seemed permanent had not been permanent at all. That realization should have been unsettling. Instead, the new banana quickly felt inevitable. This is something human beings do remarkably well. A replacement becomes normal. Then we forget there was ever anything before it. The same happened with the Cavendish. A child born after the transition could grow up believing that this was simply what bananas were: yellow, seedless, soft, sweet, curved, reliable. The genetic narrowness remained invisible. The consumer saw a fruit. A plant pathologist saw a risk. The industry saw revenue. And the fungus, somewhere in the soil, had already taught one lesson. There was no reason nature could not teach another. The Gros Michel disaster also changed the communities left behind. When companies abandoned infected districts, economic life could collapse. Railways built for banana traffic lost purpose. Workers moved if they could. Stores closed. Houses emptied. Vegetation returned. A once busy settlement might become quiet within a few years. The banana had created a peculiar kind of frontier town, except there was no gold mine beneath the ground. There was fruit above it. When the fruit disappeared, the town could disappear too. Imagine walking along an abandoned railway. Grass grows between the rails. Wooden sleepers rot beneath damp leaves. A loading platform stands empty. A building that once held company records has broken windows. The forest is returning. Perhaps families still live nearby. Perhaps older residents remember when trains passed every day. The empire has moved elsewhere. The fungus remains. There is something almost ghostly about these abandoned banana zones. They reveal how temporary industrial landscapes can be. At their height, they seem permanent. Thousands of workers, warehouses, telegraph offices, company housing, hospitals, locomotives. Then the economic reason disappears. Nature begins taking everything back. The railway becomes rust. The plantation becomes secondary growth. The company name survives only in old documents. The banana empire was powerful, but it was never stronger than ecology. By the middle of the 20th century, Cavendish was increasingly securing the future of the export trade. The crisis passed from newspaper concern into agricultural history. Companies adjusted, consumers adapted without realizing they had adapted. The banana remained cheap. The world moved on. Yet the old disease had left behind an uncomfortable truth. The banana industry could control politics more easily than biology. That truth matters, because the story does not end with Gros Michel. A new form of the same disease would later appear, one capable of attacking Cavendish. At first, it emerged far from the major plantations of Latin America. Then it spread. Scientists watched closely. Growers became nervous. Governments introduced quarantine measures. The same old questions returned. Could infected soil be contained? Could equipment spread it? Could workers accidentally carry it between fields? Could new resistant varieties be developed? Could genetic diversity be introduced without destroying the commercial system consumers had come to expect? The enemy had changed slightly. The weakness had not. The modern banana remained remarkably uniform. And so the final danger in our story is not a general, not a corporation, not a railway concession, not a strike. It is the possibility that history may repeat itself beneath the soil. For now, however, we remain in the earlier era. A plantation manager stands at the edge of a new Cavendish field. The plants are healthy. Their leaves lift into warm air. The soil is clean. The railway nearby is still busy. Workers cut green bunches. Trucks and trains carry them toward the coast. After years of retreat, the industry finally appears to have won. A different banana has saved the banana. Ships leave the harbor full. Stores remain stocked. Customers notice almost nothing. That is exactly how the companies want it. The greatest crisis in the history of the fruit has been hidden behind continuity. Tomorrow morning, someone will peel a banana over breakfast. They will see the familiar pale flesh. They will throw away the skin. They will never know that the fruit in their hand is the survivor of an agricultural disaster. And they will certainly not know that beneath plantations on the other side of the world, the next version of the same enemy is already waiting for its chance. The new banana looks ordinary. That is its greatest achievement. After the collapse of Gros Michel across many plantations, the Cavendish did not arrive in northern kitchens as a dramatic replacement. There was no ceremony, no warning that one familiar fruit had quietly been pushed aside by another. The banana simply remained yellow, soft, sweet, convenient. The consumer kept peeling, the industry kept shipping, and for a while it appeared that the great biological crisis had been solved. Cavendish varieties resisted the strain of Panama disease that had devastated Gros Michel. Plantations were replanted, packing methods improved, refrigerated transport became more sophisticated, ripening could be controlled more carefully near the market. The banana became easier to manage than ever before. A fruit that had once depended on wind, luck, and frantic unloading at the harbor now moved through a highly organized cold chain. Green fruit could be cut in the tropics, washed, sorted, packed into boxes, loaded into refrigerated ships or containers, carried across oceans, moved into ripening rooms near the destination, then exposed to carefully managed conditions so the fruit turned yellow at roughly the right moment. The old race against rot had not disappeared. It had become scientific. Temperature was controlled, airflow was controlled, timing was controlled. Ripening itself became part of industrial logistics. This was an extraordinary transformation. The banana had once resisted long-distance trade because it was too alive. Modern commerce solved the problem by learning to manage that life, not perfectly, but well enough that millions of people could begin believing bananas simply appeared. This illusion was stronger than ever. A shopper in London could pick up a bunch without imagining Central America. A family in Edinburgh could eat tropical fruit during cold weather. A child in York could carry a banana to school in a way that would have seemed absurd to people living there centuries earlier. Distance had nearly disappeared, at least from the consumer's perspective. On the producing side, distance still mattered very much. Bananas continued to grow in warm, wet regions. Workers still cut them by hand. Tropical storms still damaged plantations. Floods still mattered. Labor conditions still mattered. Land still mattered. And disease still mattered. Cavendish had solved one disease problem. It had not solved the deeper problem of genetic sameness. The global export trade once again centered heavily on a narrow group of bananas that behaved predictably. That predictability made modern supply chains possible. It also meant that millions of plants shared similar vulnerabilities. For years, the threat remained distant enough to ignore. Then another form of Panama disease began attracting attention. A new strain could infect Cavendish bananas at first. This seemed like a regional agricultural problem. Then the disease appeared in more places. The old fear returned: soil, water, tools, vehicles, boots. Anything carrying contaminated material could potentially help the fungus move. Unlike an insect pest, the disease could remain hidden in the ground. A healthy-looking plantation could exist near contamination without managers immediately realizing what was happening. Then yellow leaves appeared. The old pattern, the old dread. The modern version of the disease became known for threatening the very banana that had replaced Gros Michel. History seemed to be circling back toward itself. The banana industry had escaped one catastrophe by changing varieties. Now the replacement was vulnerable too. This did not mean every Cavendish plantation was about to disappear. Agricultural disease is more complicated than that. Spread can be slow. Quarantine can matter. Farm practices can matter. Research can matter. New varieties can be developed. But the structural problem remains difficult. Consumers expect a familiar banana. Retailers expect a familiar banana. Shipping companies expect a familiar banana. The global system is built around sameness. Imagine trying to replace it again. A new banana might resist disease, but would it travel well? Would it ripen evenly? Would customers like the taste? Would the skin survive transport? Would plantations produce enough? Would stores accept fruit with a different shape or color? A banana can succeed biologically and fail commercially. That is the strange prison modern agriculture creates. The best fruit for nature is not always the best fruit for a supermarket. Diversity makes ecosystems stronger. Uniformity makes logistics easier. The banana lives between those two truths. Researchers have spent years studying ways to protect the crop. Some search for naturally resistant varieties, others cross different banana lines. Some use modern genetic techniques. Growers experiment with soil management, sanitation, and quarantine. Governments monitor outbreaks. Plantations restrict movement in contaminated areas. Vehicles may be cleaned. Tools may be disinfected. Workers may be asked to avoid carrying soil between fields. The enemy is microscopic. The defenses can involve entire bureaucracies. There is something quietly absurd about this. The banana began as a plant selected by farmers thousands of years ago. Now protecting it may require laboratories, genetic research, international quarantine systems, border controls and strict plantation hygiene. The fruit became global, so did its problems. And the modern banana carries another burden inherited from its commercial history: low price. Consumers have been trained to expect bananas to be cheap, very cheap. This expectation shapes everything behind the supermarket display. Retailers compete on price. Importers negotiate tightly. Growers operate under narrow margins. Workers may experience the pressure at the far end of the chain. A small increase in wages or environmental standards may seem reasonable on the plantation. By the time costs move through the system, every participant argues about who should pay. The customer often remains unaware. The banana is supposed to be inexpensive. That assumption feels natural now. Historically, it is anything but natural. A tropical fruit transported thousands of miles, kept within a carefully controlled temperature range, ripened near its destination, inspected, distributed, and displayed, should not obviously be one of the cheapest fruits in the store. Its low price is the result of more than efficient farming. It is the inheritance of a system built on enormous scale: cheap land, cheap transport, cheap labor, political concessions, standardization, control. The modern supply chain is more regulated and more complex than the old banana kingdoms, but the historical pressure remains. Keep the banana cheap. Keep it uniform, keep it available, every day, every season, every year. Consumers have become accustomed to permanence. A banana shortage now feels strange. This is remarkable when you remember how fragile the crop can be. Bananas dislike cold. They dislike strong winds. They can suffer from drought. They can suffer from excessive water. They face fungi, insects, and other diseases. The fruit bruises easily. Once ripening begins, timing becomes critical. And the dominant commercial varieties reproduce in ways that limit genetic diversity. Almost everything about the banana seems designed to make global trade difficult, yet global trade succeeds most of the time. Perhaps that is why the fruit remains interesting. Its ordinariness is artificial. Every ordinary banana is the end result of an extraordinary amount of coordination. A worker cuts it at the correct stage. Someone washes and grades it. Someone packs it. Someone records the box. Someone moves it to a port. Someone monitors temperature. Someone crosses an ocean with it. Someone moves it into a ripening facility. Someone releases it toward stores at the right moment. And finally, someone places it into a bowl at home. The customer performs the easiest part: peel, eat, forget. The banana industry depends partly on that forgetting, not because every modern banana hides a scandal, but because most commodities become comfortable only when their histories disappear. Coffee becomes a cup. Chocolate becomes a bar. Sugar becomes a spoonful. The banana becomes a snack. The field disappears. The labor disappears. The politics disappear. The disease disappears. The ship disappears. Only the product remains. Yet sometimes history returns in small ways. A news report mentions Panama disease. A storm damages plantations. A labor dispute interrupts exports. A shipping problem causes prices to rise. Suddenly, the customer notices that bananas come from somewhere. For a moment, geography reappears. Then the shelves fill again, and the illusion of permanence returns. The Cavendish has been remarkably successful at maintaining that illusion. It survived where Gros Michel failed. It adapted to modern transport. It became the shape people now imagine when they hear the word banana. But survival is not the same as safety. That distinction is important. A crop can dominate the market and still be vulnerable. An empire can look stable and still depend on delicate systems. History has already demonstrated this once. There is no reason to believe biology has forgotten. The comparison with Gros Michel is especially uncomfortable because the earlier industry also believed it had found the perfect commercial banana. Gros Michel traveled well, consumers liked it, plantations produced it on a huge scale, then disease changed everything. Cavendish now occupies a similar position. It is familiar, profitable, global, and exposed. The difference is that scientists understand much more today. Plant pathology is more advanced, genetics is more advanced, international disease monitoring is more advanced. Growers have more tools. The industry is not helpless. But science cannot erase the fundamental trade-off between genetic uniformity and resilience. A plantation containing many different banana varieties may be harder for one disease to devastate completely. It is also harder to fit into a global supply chain expecting identical fruit. The future of the banana may therefore require consumers to accept something commerce has spent more than a century teaching them not to accept: difference. Different sizes, different flavors, different colors, different textures, perhaps even bananas that do not look quite like the banana in a cartoon. That would be a curious ending to the long history of standardization. The industry spent generations making bananas identical. Its survival may eventually depend on making them less so. The danger today is therefore quieter than the political violence of the old Banana Republic era. No president needs to be overthrown for a fungus to spread. No soldiers need to fire. No railway concession needs to be signed. A handful of contaminated soil can carry enough history. The modern threat works beneath the surface. And perhaps that makes it more fitting. The banana has always hidden its complications well. Its peel is simple, its history is not. By now, the fruit has survived ancient migration, Atlantic empire, plantation expansion, dangerous voyages, corporate consolidation, labor unrest, political intervention, and one enormous disease crisis. It has changed varieties, changed ships, changed packaging, changed markets, changed public image. And through all of it, the consumer experience has remained strangely stable. Hold the stem, break the peel, pull it downward, eat. Few foods offer such an easy ending to such a difficult journey. But our journey is not quite finished. There is still one final place to go. Not back to Guatemala, not to a company office, not beneath diseased leaves, back to the kitchen, back to the ordinary fruit bowl. Because the strangest part of the banana's history is not that companies fought over it, not that governments feared it, not that disease nearly destroyed it. The strangest part is that almost none of this history changed the way the fruit feels in the hand. It remains light, soft, unthreatening. A banana cannot reveal the railway that carried its ancestors. It cannot reveal the workers who organized beneath tropical rain. It cannot reveal the ministers who signed away land. It cannot reveal the ships that raced north before the cargo turned yellow. It cannot reveal the fungus waiting beneath the soil. It simply sits there, quiet, familiar, almost boring, and perhaps that is why its history is worth remembering. Danger does not always look dangerous. Sometimes it arrives wrapped in something cheerful. Sometimes power hides behind convenience. Sometimes an empire can fit inside a lunchbox. Tonight, somewhere in a warehouse, thousands of green bananas are waiting for the command to ripen. Their temperature is monitored. Their timing is planned. Their destination is already known. Tomorrow, trucks will carry them towards stores. People will buy them without ceremony. The system will work so smoothly that it will disappear. And beneath that smoothness lies the same old race. The fruit against time, the industry against disease, uniformity against survival. The banana is still running, for now it is winning. And now, after all that distance, we return to the fruit bowl. The room is quiet. Morning has not yet arrived. On a kitchen counter somewhere far from the tropics, a small bunch of bananas waits beneath the darkness. Yesterday, the skins were green around the edges. Tomorrow, they may be spotted with brown. Tonight, they are yellow. Perfect, perhaps, and completely unaware of history. There is something almost unfair about how innocent a banana looks. No other object in our story has remained so calm. Governments have fallen. Workers have marched. Soldiers have fired. Railways have been swallowed by vegetation. Companies have merged, expanded, changed names, and disappeared. Plantations have been abandoned, diseases have crossed borders, ships have changed from wooden sailing vessels to steamships, refrigerated freighters, and modern container transport. But the banana remains curved, soft, quiet. You peel it, you eat it. Nothing about this small act suggests danger. And perhaps that is the final trick of the world's most dangerous fruit. The danger was never really inside the banana, it was around it. Human beings created the danger by deciding that this fragile tropical fruit should be available cheaply, reliably, and in enormous quantities thousands of miles from where it grew. Once that decision became normal, an entire system had to be constructed to support it. Think again about where we began. Long before corporations, the ancestors of modern bananas grew in Southeast Asia and the Western Pacific. Their fruits contained hard seeds. They were not designed for supermarkets. They were not designed for ships. They were not designed for us at all. People changed them. Farmers selected useful plants. They preserved plants with softer fruit and fewer troublesome seeds. They carried shoots into new landscapes. Generation followed generation. Nobody knew where the journey would end. A farmer planting a banana near a home thousands of years ago could not imagine a refrigerated vessel carrying millions of fruits across an ocean. Yet the first step toward that vessel was already being taken. The banana became dependent upon people, and people became increasingly interested in the banana. The plant traveled west. It entered Africa. It became part of diets and agricultural traditions across tropical regions. It moved through the Indian Ocean world. Eventually, it reached Atlantic islands. Then it crossed into the Americas. There, it entered a landscape already being transformed by conquest, slavery, plantations, and global commerce. Still, the banana remained mostly local. The problem was time. It ripened too quickly. The fruit could grow in abundance near the Caribbean coast and still be almost worthless to a customer in New York if it could not reach that customer before becoming soft. So businessmen attacked time. Steamships made voyages more predictable. Railways carried fruit from plantations to ports. Telegraphs helped coordinate schedules. Warehouses improved, ventilation improved, refrigeration improved, ripening became controlled. Every technological step pushed the banana farther from the soil where it grew. And with each step, the system became larger. A merchant buying a few bunches needed little political influence. A corporation building railways needed much more. Land had to be acquired, concessions negotiated, taxes discussed, ports constructed, workers recruited, governments persuaded. The banana began accumulating power because its weakness demanded infrastructure. That may be the central irony of the entire story. A fruit too delicate to travel easily helped create companies strong enough to influence nations. The banana was weak. The system around it became hard. Steel rails crossed tropical lowlands. Locomotives moved through rain. Company ships sailed according to strict schedules. Plantations expanded across enormous areas. Workers arrived from distant islands and neighboring countries. Towns appeared. Hospitals opened. Company stores sold food. Children grew up beside tracks built for fruit. Then the companies discovered something beyond transportation: dependency. If a country depended heavily on banana exports, the company producing those exports mattered. If a region depended on company railways, the owner of those railways mattered. If thousands of workers depended on company wages, company decisions mattered. The corporation no longer needed to behave like an ordinary guest. It had become part of the house. This did not mean fruit companies literally controlled every government where they operated. History was more complicated. Local elites had power, armies had power, workers had power when they organized. Foreign governments had their own strategic goals. Political movements emerged for reasons much larger than bananas, but the companies possessed enough influence to shape choices. Sometimes that influence was quiet: a favorable tax agreement, a land concession, a private conversation, a railway contract. Sometimes it became impossible to ignore: a strike, soldiers, a land reform crisis, a covert intervention. The banana moved from breakfast into foreign policy without ever changing its shape. And at the bottom of this system were the people who actually touched the fruit. Workers cut the bunches, carried them, loaded trains, repaired tracks, dug drainage canals, worked docks, maintained engines, built bridges, cooked meals in plantation settlements, treated the sick, raised children, buried the dead. Their names rarely reached consumers. This is common in commodity history. The closer a person stands to the product, the farther that person may be from the story told about it. Advertising prefers sunshine. History contains mud. The old banana companies became skilled at selling the sunshine. A tropical image could be cheerful, bright, healthy, abundant. The customer did not need to imagine mosquitoes, or labor contractors, or company lawyers, or land disputes. The peel became a curtain. Behind it, the system continued, then nature entered the story again. Panama disease attacked Gros Michel. The industry that had become skilled at influencing human institutions confronted an organism that had no institution to influence. The fungus did not recognize property deeds. It did not respect borders. It did not care whether the plantation manager knew a president. It entered roots. Plants died. Fields became unusable for the vulnerable variety. Companies moved. New land was cleared. New railways were built. The disease followed. Eventually, the industry had to do something it had spent decades avoiding. Change the banana. Cavendish replaced Gros Michel across much of the export trade, and once again, the consumer barely noticed. That may be the most impressive part of the entire industrial transformation. Imagine another major food changing its dominant variety across global markets, while millions of customers simply continue eating breakfast. No great farewell, no ceremony, one banana fades. Another takes its place. The system survives, but the weakness survives too. Uniformity. Modern Cavendish plantations provide the consistency that global commerce loves. The fruit looks familiar, ripens predictably, fits existing expectations, yet genetic similarity creates vulnerability. A disease capable of attacking one plant may encounter vast numbers of similar plants waiting beyond it. The old lesson returns. Efficiency is not resilience. Sometimes they pull in opposite directions. The modern banana industry, therefore, lives with a strange inheritance. It is more technologically advanced than anything the early fruit merchants could have imagined. Scientists study pathogens, plant breeders search for resistance, quarantine systems attempt to slow disease. Shipping temperatures are carefully controlled. Ripening rooms manage the final transformation from green to yellow. Supply chains cross oceans with extraordinary precision, and still the industry depends on a plant that can become sick. Technology has defeated distance. It has not defeated biology. Perhaps it never will. That does not mean bananas are about to disappear. Predictions of extinction make dramatic headlines, but agriculture is rarely so simple. Researchers have options. Different varieties exist. Breeding continues. Genetic techniques offer possibilities. Farmers adapt. Disease can be monitored and managed. The future may contain bananas that differ from the familiar Cavendish. Perhaps that would be healthy. For most of banana history, diversity was normal. It was global commerce that taught millions of customers to imagine there should be only one correct banana. Maybe the strange yellow uniformity of the supermarket shelf is the unusual part. Travel through regions where bananas have been cultivated for generations and the wider family becomes visible. Small bananas, large bananas, red-skinned bananas, cooking bananas, sweet bananas, firm bananas, soft bananas, varieties adapted to particular soils, meals, and local preferences. The Cavendish is not the banana. It is one successful answer to a commercial problem, and commercial answers do not last forever. The Gros Michel already proved that, so perhaps the future banana will look different. Perhaps consumers will learn to accept variety. Perhaps disease-resistant cultivars will spread. Perhaps supermarket displays will become less uniform. If so, the banana will simply be returning to something closer to its ancient condition. Many forms, many tastes. Many local relationships, less sameness. The irony would be gentle. After centuries of industrial effort to make every banana identical, survival might depend upon allowing bananas to become different again. But there is another part of the history worth carrying away tonight. Cheapness has a history too. We tend to think of price as a simple fact. A banana costs what a banana costs. Yet the low price of the fruit was constructed over generations. Large plantations lowered production costs. Railways lowered transport time. Steamships lowered uncertainty. Corporate integration reduced dependence on outside carriers. Political concessions reduced expenses. Low wages reduced expenses. Refrigeration reduced spoilage. Standardization reduced complexity. Modern logistics reduced waste. Every layer pushed the retail price downward. Some of those developments were genuine technological progress. Others transferred costs onto people who had little power to refuse them. The customer saw only the final number. This happens with many things. A cheap object rarely explains why it is cheap. A shirt does not tell you who stitched it. A chocolate bar does not describe the cocoa farm. A cup of coffee does not name the people who harvested the beans. And a banana does not tell you about the land beneath its roots. Commodities are excellent at silence. Perhaps that is why their histories can be so revealing. Take something ordinary and follow it backward. Soon the ordinary world becomes enormous. A banana leads to botany, then migration, then maritime trade, then colonialism, then slavery and plantation economies, then steam power, railways, corporate consolidation, labor movements, foreign policy, Cold War intervention, plant pathology, genetics, global logistics, all hidden inside something you can eat while standing over a kitchen sink. History does not always hide in castles. Sometimes it waits in the fruit bowl, and there is something comforting in that as well. The past is not a separate country sealed behind museum glass. It survives in ordinary habits, the food we eat, the roads we use, the words we speak, the boundaries on maps, the plants growing in fields. Even breakfast can carry ancient journeys. Perhaps somewhere in your own family history, an ancestor once saw a banana for the first time. Imagine that moment. Perhaps it happened in London. Perhaps in a port city. Perhaps near a market where imported fruit hung from a stall. The banana might have seemed peculiar. Its curved shape, its thick peel, its soft flesh, its tropical origin. That ancestor could hardly have imagined that descendants would one day consider it boring. There is a strange measure of technological success in boredom. The impossible becomes expensive, then possible, then common, then invisible. Eventually someone complains because the bananas at the store are slightly too green. That complaint contains centuries of progress. A medieval merchant would be astonished. An early banana importer would probably be furious. He had risked an entire cargo on weather. You're annoyed because breakfast will be ready tomorrow instead of today. History can be cruel. It can also be quietly funny, and the banana deserves a little humor. After all, this is still a fruit whose greatest defense is appeal. For all the politics attached to it, the banana itself has never become impressive. A pineapple at least looks armed. A coconut can injure someone through simple gravity. A durian arrives wearing armor. The banana looks like it has already surrendered. Perhaps that softness helped disguise everything built around it. No one expects geopolitical trouble from a fruit that can be mashed with a fork, yet there it was. Land, railways, ships, governments, workers, disease, all following the curve of a banana. The modern corporations descended from the old fruit empires have changed considerably. Countries have changed too. Labor laws, international standards, environmental expectations, trade relationships, and political institutions are not what they were during the height of the old banana kingdoms. The past should not be flattened onto the present as though nothing changed. Much did, but history leaves structures behind. Land ownership patterns can persist, trade dependence can persist, consumer expectations persist, the desire for low prices persists, and the biological vulnerability created by uniform crops certainly persists. So the dangerous banana has not vanished. Its dangers have changed. The old danger was sometimes political, sometimes economic, sometimes physical. The modern danger is more often systemic. A disease spreading through a uniform crop, a storm disrupting a concentrated producing region, workers carrying the burden of price pressure, environmental damage accumulating quietly, supply chains so efficient that consumers forget how fragile they really are. None of this requires panic. The point is almost the opposite. The banana is worth noticing, not fearing. Notice the system, notice the distance, notice how much work hides inside convenience. Then eat the banana. History does not require guilt at breakfast, only curiosity, and perhaps gratitude. Someone planted it, someone cared for it, someone cut it green, someone moved it, someone kept it cool, someone inspected it, someone placed it where you could buy it. Thousands of years of agricultural knowledge stand behind that simple act. So do mistakes, ambition, exploitation, innovation, resistance, adaptation. The banana carries all of them without knowing anything about them. Outside, the night grows deeper. The kitchen remains still. The bananas on the counter continue their slow chemical transformation. Green disappears. Sugar increases. The clock beneath the skin keeps moving. It is the same clock that frightened merchants aboard sailing ships. The same clock that encouraged faster steamships. The same clock that made railways valuable. The same clock around which enormous companies organized tropical landscapes. Tomorrow, one of these bananas may be perfect. The next day, perhaps slightly spotted. A few days later, someone may decide it belongs in banana bread. Even empires eventually become overripe. There is a final irony here. For all the human effort spent controlling bananas, the fruit still refuses complete obedience. It ripens when biology tells it to. It bruises. It becomes sick. It responds to heat. It responds to cold. It carries no respect for corporate schedules. We have become extraordinarily good at managing it, but management is not mastery. Perhaps the banana has been reminding us of this for centuries. Human beings build systems and call them permanent. Nature waits. A railway looks eternal until vines grow over the tracks. A corporation looks invincible until markets change. A plantation looks endless until disease enters the soil. A government looks stable until people stop believing in it. And a green banana looks patient until suddenly it is yellow. Everything ripens. Everything changes. Everything eventually gives way to something else. The banana empire did. Gros Michel did. The Cavendish may someday do the same. But the banana itself, in one form or another, will probably continue its much older journey. Farmers will plant it, families will cook it, children will peel it, scientists will study it, traders will move it. And future generations may look back at our perfectly uniform yellow bananas with the same curiosity we now reserve for the vanished plantations of Gros Michel. Perhaps they will wonder why we insisted every banana should look alike. Perhaps they will eat varieties we would barely recognize. Perhaps they will know more about where their food comes from. Or perhaps they will do exactly what people have always done: eat first, ask questions much later. For tonight, however, there are no more questions. The ships have reached port, the locomotives have gone quiet, the workers have left the fields, the government offices are dark, the old company ledgers gather dust. Rain falls over abandoned railway lines somewhere in the tropics. Leaves grow between the sleepers. In another plantation, new plants rise from wet soil. And far away, on an ordinary kitchen counter, a banana waits for morning. It looks harmless. Maybe it always was. The dangerous part was us. Our hunger for cheapness, our hunger for control, our belief that nature could be standardized forever. Our willingness to ignore distant people when the product in front of us was convenient enough. And our extraordinary ability to build empires around things that seem too ordinary to deserve a second thought. So the next time you see a banana, perhaps you will remember just a little of what followed it across the world: the ancient farmers, the tropical gardens, the Atlantic crossing, the ships racing against yellow skin, the railways disappearing into rain, the workers beneath enormous leaves, the company towns, the strikes, the presidents, the land disputes, the fungus waiting underground, and the replacement banana that quietly took the old one's place. Then, perhaps, you will peel it and eat it anyway. Because after thousands of years of cultivation, centuries of trade, decades of corporate conflict, political upheaval, and one very persistent fungal enemy, that is still what the banana was meant for. Not empire, not politics, not profit, just food. The room is quiet now. The fruit bowl can keep its secrets until morning, and somewhere beyond the window, while the world sleeps, another shipment of green bananas is already making its way toward breakfast.